the silence they didn't expect. You cut contact. Maybe it was clean, maybe it was messy, but either way, you stopped answering. No text back, no calls, just gone. And somewhere, they're sitting in a room that suddenly feels too big, staring at their phone like it might explain what happened. What you're not seeing is the particular kind of panic that hits when someone realizes they can no longer reach you. It's not sadness first, it's disorientation. Their brain was built to predict your patterns, to anticipate your reactions, to construct a whole internal model of how you work, which buttons do what, which silences mean what. That map just got erased. All those little rituals, the text that would make you respond, the call time you'd pick up, the way they could get under your skin and feel alive doing it. Those routes are suddenly closed. They're left holding a phone that doesn't ring, checking an inbox that doesn't fill, and the absence feels bigger than any rejection could. They're not feeling abandoned the way you might think. They're feeling invisible, unimportant enough to stop the game. For someone used to mattering to you, even in dysfunction, the flip switches off and the house goes dark. They might get angry. They might spiral, trying to figure out what went wrong, rewriting conversations, analyzing silences for clues you never planted. They might even text you something cruel, hoping you'll respond, because a bad reaction is still proof they moved the needle. The silence you've created is an absence they have to live in. An absence is harder to fight than anything you could say. That's the weight they're carrying right now. First, 48 hours of denial. 6 hours after you leave, they're already doing something they probably won't admit to until weeks later, checking if you've posted anything, refreshing their messages to see if you've come back, or finding small reasons to text you about something totally normal. Not because they want you back yet, but because their brain is still operating as if you exist in the same orbit. The first 48 hours aren't really about missing you. They're about the brain refusing to update its operating system. You left the group chat, you didn't reply to the thing they said, and their mind is stuck in the loop of, you should be replying right now. This isn't sadness yet. It's the neural equivalent of a computer running a program that no longer has permission to open. So they find ways to keep the script alive without quite admitting that's what they're doing. Maybe they call a friend and talk about you. Maybe they drive past somewhere you both went. Maybe they construct this whole narrative about how you'll be back in a few days anyway, so why bother adjusting to the silence? The denial isn't stupid. It's actually a survival mechanism. Your brain doesn't want to absorb the shock all at once, so it keeps playing the old tape, keeps acting like the rules haven't changed. They're not thinking about a future without you yet. They're still standing in the moment you walked away, replaying it, wondering if there's still a rewind button. That strange, muffled quiet they're feeling. That's not the pain yet. It's a system trying to run on a closed circuit, gears still turning towards someone who's no longer there. Phantom notification syndrome. You're sitting on your couch, phone silent on the table, and suddenly you feel it. That vibration against your thigh that wasn't there. Your hand moves before your brain catches up. Nothing. A few minutes later, it happens again. And this time, you're pretty sure it was real. This is phantom notification syndrome, and it's not you being paranoid. It's your nervous system stuck in a loop it built during the relationship, still expecting their text to land, still braced for that small hit of dopamine that used to come with their name on your screen. Your brain doesn't care that they're not texting anymore. The neural pathway is carved deep. Every time you felt that vibration before, there was a reward at the end of it. So now your body keeps running the old script, phantom and all. The thing about this syndrome is that it reveals something crucial about how hooked you were, not in a shameful way, but in a literal neurochemical way. When someone is present and unpredictable, your brain treats them like a slot machine. Maybe you get the jackpot, maybe you don't, but that uncertainty is what keeps pulling the lever. After you leave, your nervous system doesn't just switch off. It keeps listening, keeps waiting, because the wiring was built for them specifically. The phantom feeling usually fades in weeks, especially if you're not checking your phone every 30 seconds, hoping you're wrong about the silence. But while it's happening, try to notice it without judgment. It's not weakness, it's just your nervous system being honest about how deep the attachment ran. And that honesty is the first step toward letting the loop quiet down, the power vacuum you leave. When you disappear, you don't just vanish. You leave a shape behind, an absence the size of every role you played, the person they could call at 2 a.m., the one they could blame when nothing else made sense, the mirror they checked themselves against every single day. That vacuum doesn't stay empty long. They fill it with versions of you, not the real you, but the fantasy that might return, the villain that proves they were right to let you go, the soulmate who finally understands. The internal theater runs all night. Think about what you actually were in their day. You were the solution to being alone without having to change anything. You were the reason to stay still. You were the villain they could rage at instead of asking why they needed one in the first place. The moment you leave, they face the actual structure of their own life. And most people don't just panic, they scramble to rebuild the walls you knocked down. What fills the vacuum depends on who they are. Some become obsessed with rewriting the whole story, so you're the soulmate who slipped away. Others get angry because rage at you requires far less emotional work than grief for themselves. A few go quiet and numb, which is its own kind of drowning, but almost all of them do the same thing. They try not to feel the emptiness by telling a story about you instead. The story keeps them from sitting with the real weight that you're gone and they're now responsible for their own company, their own reasons to wake up. That responsibility feels heavier than they ever imagined it would be. Reactance and forbidden access. You tell someone they can't have something and suddenly they want it more. Not because the thing itself changed, but because your boundary just made it forbidden. That ache to get past a wall, to prove they can still reach you, to restore what they lost, that's reactance. And during no contact, it's firing on all cylinders in their nervous system. When you disappear, you're not just removing yourself. You're removing their choice to contact you, to explain, to negotiate, to see if they can still get in. The door slamming shuts off a freedom they took for granted, and the human brain does not like freedoms being taken away. It fights back. It amplifies the wanting. They might feel more drawn to you now than they did when you answered texts. The restriction paradoxically makes the restricted thing more valuable. Here's where it gets tricky. This doesn't mean they suddenly love you more or see your worth. It means their psychology is screaming that access has been lost and their mind is working overtime to restore it. They might craft new angles, reaching through mutual friends, testing your boundaries with breadcrumbs, even hurting you further to provoke a reaction that means you're still there, still responding, still accessible. Reactance doesn't care about truth. It only cares about restoring agency. Your job is to stay the course anyway. The more consistently forbidden that access stays, the slower their reactance cycle winds down. They will eventually bore into sadness, but first they will rage against the locked door, knowing that this fury isn't love but a mechanical push against lost control might make it easier to keep your hand off the handle. Intermittent reinforcement withdrawal. You know that feeling when a slot machine stops paying out? Your brain goes haywire. You keep pulling the lever faster, longer, even though nothing comes. That's not stupidity. That's neuroscience. Intermittent reinforcement is the most addictive reward pattern there is. And when it suddenly stops, the person left behind doesn't just feel sad, they feel desperate. Here's what happened between you two. They didn't love you consistently. Maybe they were hot and cold, disappearing for days, then suddenly attentive, cruel one moment, tender the next, apologetic, then distant again. Your nervous system learned to chase those unpredictable hits of affection because the uncertainty itself, the not knowing when the next reward would come, lit up their dopamine like nothing else could. Consistency is boring to the addicted brain. Mystery is currency. Now you're gone. No contact means the reinforcement doesn't just become negative, it stops entirely. And here's the trap they're in. Extinction doesn't feel like freedom to an intermittently reinforced person. It feels like the machine is broken, not closed. Their instinct is to shake it harder, to reach out one more time, to create a reason to contact you because in their wired reality, you're the only source of that erratic, intoxicating reward. They're not grieving you the way a person grieves someone they loved steadily. They're experiencing withdrawal from a chemical pattern. No contact works precisely because it removes the variable reward, but understanding this means you can stop interpreting their pushback, their sudden "I miss you" texts, their hoovering as proof you made a mistake. You didn't. You ended the machine. Now they're just listening to it rattle. Dopamine crash after supply cut. You've probably felt it yourself. That empty flatness the day after a vacation ends or a show you've been binging finishes, the stimulation stops, and suddenly the world feels gray. That's dopamine. When you went no contact, you didn't just remove a person, you removed a primary dopamine factory their nervous system had learned to crave on schedule. Every text, every fight and makeup, every reconciliation was a chemical spark. Their brain was wired to that rhythm. Now there's silence, and in the first week or two, their dopamine actually crashes. Their body is in genuine withdrawal, not from love, but from the pattern it depended on to feel okay. This is why they can't simply walk away and heal. Their brain is experiencing a real neurochemical deficit, and you were the only source they knew how to access to fix it. So they reach out frantically, casually, strategically, not necessarily because they suddenly understood what they lost, but because their nervous system is screaming for restoration. They might not know this consciously, they just feel something hurting, and they remember you stopped that hurt before. That chemical hunger looks identical to love from the inside, even when it's not. When you see the obsessive text or spiraling behavior, you're watching a nervous system in genuine distress, learning how to make its own baseline peace. The hoovering, the late night, "I miss you," the breadcrumbs, it's their system hunting for equilibrium through the only channel it remembers. Understanding this doesn't change your boundary or mean you should go back. It just clarifies what you're actually witnessing. Chemistry in crisis, not suddenly discovered love. The narrative they tell others. Right after you leave, something shifts in how they talk to people. They cannot just say you're gone. That would require them to feel discarded, and most people don't sit in that feeling very long without it eating them from the inside. So they build a different story. They tell their friends, "You were never quite right." They mention small things you did wrong, exaggerate them just enough that people nod, and suddenly the breakup makes sense. Maybe they even paint themselves as the one who made the hard choice, the one who was strong enough to walk away. This is not technically lying. It is survival. When you are the person left behind, the narrative you tell your circle becomes the narrative you tell yourself. It has to, because you need to feel like you still have agency, like you chose something instead of being chosen away from. Without that story, they would drown in the feeling of being discarded. So they curate, they edit. After a few months, they might even believe their own version entirely. Here's what matters. The story rippling through their friend group right now is almost never actually about you. It is them frantically rebuilding a version of events where they are still the main character with power, where losing you makes some kind of sense. You might hear pieces of it distorted and reassembled and feel fury at being misrepresented. Fighting that narrative only cements it deeper. The sharper move is to let them have their story. It will collapse under its own weight eventually, and it has zero power over what really happened between you. Ego preservation through blame. The moment you left, something inside them started rearranging the story. Not consciously, not with a plan. Your absence triggered a survival mechanism older than thought. Their brain did what it does best, protect the self-image at almost any cost. You didn't leave because they were distant, controlling, or emotionally unavailable. You left because you were weak, selfish, couldn't handle a real relationship, or were seduced by something shallow and new. Watch how fast the blame lands. It has to, because the alternative is unbearable. If they were truly the problem, then they were the problem all along, and that means they are fundamentally broken in ways that matter. So instead, they build you into a villain. It takes the heat off their own fractures. This isn't cruelty. It's desperation wearing a mask. When someone's identity is built on being the good one, the loyal one, the one who tried their hardest, losing you becomes a threat to their entire self-concept. The ego doesn't negotiate. It eliminates the threat by flipping the script. You become proof of your failure, not their shortcoming. It's why they can feel genuinely wronged. In their narrative, they are the injured party. The more they repeat it, the more real it feels. And here is what matters for you. Understanding this doesn't make you forgive them or take them back. It just means you stop waiting for them to see the truth. They aren't avoiding that truth because they haven't thought hard enough. They're protecting something too precious to lose, their own goodness in their own story. That's where they'll stay, at least until something forces them to crack. Delayed emotional object permanence. You leave and suddenly they text you. 2 days pass. Then they're silent. Then they text again, longer this time, maybe angry or desperate. It feels chaotic, right? Like they can't decide what they want. But what's actually happening is something stranger. They don't believe you exist when you're not in front of them. I don't mean literally, I mean emotionally. When you're gone, the version of you they've built in their mind fades, so they reach out to bring you back into focus, to make you real again, because the absence of your presence is literally an absence of you in their inner world. Then you respond, you're solid again, and they can breathe. But the moment you go quiet or leave the conversation, that feeling of your existence dims. Their brain didn't develop the capacity to hold on to someone's emotional realness over time the way secure people do. For secure people, you exist in memory and feeling even when silent. For them, silence equals erasure. So they panic text, they rage, they cycle between needing you desperately and then acting like you never mattered. It's not manipulation, though it feels like it. It's a genuine neurological gap. Their emotional development got stuck at a stage where object permanence was still learning to form. The important part for you: understand that their reaching out isn't necessarily about love or change. It's about the terror of you disappearing from their inner experience. When you understand that, you can make clearer choices about whether their panic deserves your response. Their fear of your non-existence is real and painful for them. Your responsibility to maintain your boundary is equally real. The absence that grows louder. When someone disappears from your life, the first week often feels like relief, maybe even silence. But somewhere around day 10 or 14, something strange happens. The quiet starts to have weight. It fills rooms. It interrupts conversations. You catch yourself reaching for your phone to text them about something small, and the impulse crashes into a wall. That wall is absence. And it's not passive. It's not just the lack of something. Every notification that isn't from them becomes a small reminder. Every song they loved plays, and your nervous system does a little lurch. You might find yourself thinking about them more now than when they were around, because your brain is trying to solve the puzzle of their disappearance. Why are they gone? Will they come back? The silence becomes deafening, not because they're shouting, but because your mind is screaming questions into it. And here's what makes this tricky. They're feeling this too, but backwards. While you're lying in bed thinking about that text you didn't send, they're lying in bed noticing the absence of your presence. They're noticing they didn't check their phone for 3 hours without feeling compelled to reach out. They're noticing how many habits included you. The morning coffee tastes different because there's no one to critique how you make it, no one to steal the last sip. The louder that quiet gets for you, the more their nervous system is recalibrating to what life feels like without the anchor you represented. That absence, for them, is slowly becoming normal. And that's the painful mathematics of no contact. The longer it lasts, the more the silence works in opposite directions. Loss aversion outweighs original desire. Your brain keeps score in a rigged game. When you met them, they were just an option. Interesting maybe, but not necessary. Now that they're gone, they're not an option anymore, and your nervous system is screaming. A psychologist named Kahneman proved this years ago. Losing $20 hurts roughly twice as much as finding $20 feels good. Your brain doesn't weigh them equally. The pain of absence is always louder than the pleasure of presence ever was, and that's not metaphor. That's wiring. So they're sitting there thinking about you right now, but here's the crack in their own story. They might not be thinking about you because they miss the actual relationship. They're thinking about you because they hate that they can't access you anymore. The loss is fresh, it's active, it's a constant small ache their brain wants to solve. This is why exes come back weeks or months later, not because they suddenly remember how good it was, but because the not having became unbearable, and that feeling tricks them into calling it love. You need to know this because it changes everything about what their messages mean. When they reach out, when they say they made a mistake, listen carefully to whether they're describing the actual relationship or just the pain of losing access to it. Those are two completely different things. Most people can't tell the difference. Their brain is too busy screaming about what's missing to ask whether they actually wanted it in the first place. The emptiness feels so real that they mistake it for proof of how much you mattered. That confusion is their work to untangle, not yours. And knowing the difference is how you stay solid when they come knocking. The reactivation of pursuit instinct. The moment you actually stop chasing, their ancient wiring switches on, and they won't understand why. When you were still trying, still reaching, still leaving messages at midnight, You were playing the role they were used to. You were the hunter. Now you've stepped back and something primitive in them wakes up. That's the reactivation of pursuit instinct, and it doesn't feel like logic to them. It feels like suddenly needing you in a way they couldn't articulate before. The unavailability you create isn't punishment. It's a signal their nervous system reads as scarcity. We chase what pulls away. We want what we can't have. This isn't a psychological trick you're deploying. It's how attachment actually works deep in the brain. When they had constant access to you, they could take you for granted. Your pain didn't register as loss because loss wasn't real to them yet. But no contact creates a problem their brain has to solve. You're gone, and their mind, designed by millions of years to close gaps and reclaim what matters, starts firing in ways that surprise them. They might reframe it as something mature or rational, tell themselves they're just checking in or being mature about it, but underneath all that language, they're hunting again, remembering why they wanted you before the routine wore it down. The switch flips fast, sometimes within days. Here's what matters most. Your absence isn't cruel. It's the only language they can actually hear right now. Their pursuit instinct won't save a broken relationship or undo what was already dead, and it won't heal the wounds between you. But it will make them feel what they couldn't while you were still there, still available, still diminishing with each day. Zygarnik effect of unfinished endings. You know that feeling when a show cuts to black mid-scene and you can't stop thinking about it for days? Your brain won't let it go. That's not just frustration, it's your mind's default setting. An unfinished story creates tension, and tension demands resolution. The Zygarnik effect is the psychological principle that your brain remembers incomplete tasks far more vividly than finished ones, and it clings to them with an almost obsessive grip. When they go silent during no contact, the incompleteness becomes a psychological hook. No final conversation, no real goodbye, no closure box you can mentally check off and file away. Instead, there's a gap, and your brain hates gaps. It generates theories, rewrites history, plays out what-if scenarios on repeat. You find yourself cycling through memories, searching for the moment where things shifted, looking for the missing piece that would make the ending make sense. They feel it too, even if they're the one who initiated no contact. Silence doesn't feel like peace to them. It feels like unfinished business. Their brain is also sitting with the open loop, the conversation you didn't have, the explanation they didn't give, the way things just stopped. That's why they might check your socials, why they might break silence weeks or months later. The unfinished ending creates a gravitational pull on both sides. Understanding this doesn't solve the pull, but it reframes what you're experiencing. You're not weak for replaying things. Your brain is doing exactly what it evolved to do. Obsess over incomplete patterns until they're resolved. The resolution doesn't have to come from them. Sometimes it comes from deciding quietly and firmly that the incompleteness itself is the answer. Why closure becomes an obsession. You're scrolling through their Instagram at 2 a.m. and you realize you're not actually looking for anything. You're waiting for something. A story that explains why they left. A caption that contradicts what they told you. Some final frame that ties the whole thing together so your mind can finally rest. That waiting, that hunger for one more piece of information, that's closure obsession. and it's less about them and more about how your brain works when it feels unfinished. Your mind is a pattern completion machine. It hates loose threads. When a relationship ends without a clear narrative, without the fight you expected or the apology you deserved or the explanation that makes sense, your brain enters a low-level emergency state. It keeps replaying, keeps searching, keeps trying to build a story that holds together. The cruel part is that real closure almost never comes from them. People rarely give the speech you need. They don't call back with the full truth. They don't suddenly understand what they did wrong. They don't validate your pain in the way that would let you move. So you become the one chasing it, checking their socials, analyzing old texts for hidden meanings, hoping one more piece of information will flip a switch and make it all make sense. What actually breaks the cycle isn't a final conversation. It's deciding that you don't need their words to know your version was real, that the story that matters now is the one you write going forward, not the one you're trying to extract from them. The obsession loosens when you stop asking them to close the door and do it yourself. The rewriting of shared memory. A few months after you leave, they'll tell someone a story about something that happened between you, and you will not recognize it. Not because they're lying, but because their brain has quietly edited the tape. The fight where you stood your ground becomes the fight where you were cruel, and they were trying so hard. The night you felt ignored transforms into them holding you, caring deeply, while your coldness is all they focus on now. This isn't a conscious scheme. It's something worse. It's automatic, and it feels completely true to them the moment they say it. When someone is hurting and trying to make sense of why you left, their brain doesn't replay the memory straight. It searches for evidence of an ending that's already happened, recontextualizing every moment through the lens of loss. A neutral comment becomes unkind in hindsight. A busy week becomes proof you didn't prioritize them. Your reasons for leaving get flattened into their failure to be enough. Their brain isn't punishing you. It's creating a coherent story where the breakup makes sense, where they can live with themselves. And here's what matters. They will believe this rewrite completely. They will tell it to their therapist, their best friend, their next partner. They will wake up angry at something that didn't happen the way they remember it. You cannot correct this. You cannot get in the room and say, that's not how it was. No contact means you also don't get to watch them get it wrong about you. Don't get to defend your version of the story. That silence, that powerlessness to reshape how they remember you, that's part of the weight you carry now. Nostalgia's editing of the past. You know that moment when you suddenly remember something good from before the breakup and it hits you sideways. A laugh you both had, the way they looked at you that one morning, how easy everything felt. Your brain just served you a highlight reel, and for a second, the whole thing feels like it was mostly beautiful. That's not memory. That's a curated film. Your mind is actively editing the past, and it does this with brutal efficiency, especially when you're hurting. Neuroscience shows that nostalgia doesn't retrieve memory, it reconstructs it. Every time you think about something, you're not rewatching footage, you're rewriting it. The boring Sundays get deleted. The fights that felt small at the time suddenly look enormous in the rear view. The texting lapses and the times they weren't present either vanish or reshape into something that now feels like proof you should have seen coming. And here's what happens next. The more you replay a memory, the more unstable it becomes. Repetition doesn't strengthen accuracy. It lets emotion recolor everything, frame by frame. What you're calling nostalgia is your brain taking a complicated human relationship full of contradiction, uncertainty, effort, and apathy all at once, and smoothing it into a story that feels clean, either a tragedy or a lost paradise, depending on which wounds are loudest that day. The person they really were, the relationship as it actually lived, that's already gone. What you're mourning now isn't even them anymore. It's the edited version your grief keeps revising with each loop. Knowing this won't make it hurt less today, but it might help you question that pull when the narrative starts playing at 3 a.m, when you're most vulnerable to believing your own edited past. Comparison to new options fails. You wait for the moment your ex looks at someone new and suddenly sees the gap. They'll measure this person against you, realize what they lost, come back. It doesn't happen that way. Here's the thing. Human brains don't stack up the past and present on a scale and do the math. Instead, your ex's mind locks the new person into fresh territory, a whole separate context with no history, no disappointment layered in, no boring routines or Tuesday arguments living in the same neural file. That new person gets judged on their own terms entirely, not as a ratio of you. You've been shelved. Your ex isn't thinking, this person is 80% as good. They're thinking, this person is new, and newness itself is a drug. The new person benefits from what psychologists call the halo effect. Because there's zero shared history, they shine untested. They haven't failed on a random March Tuesday. They haven't disappointed anyone yet. They don't carry the weight of unmet needs or the dust of routines that got stale. Your ex's brain doesn't pull your file and compare. It's chasing dopamine, the lift of the unfamiliar, the story that this time could actually be different. And that story is potent because it hasn't been lived long enough to crack. So the moment you're waiting for, where they see the new person and finally understand how remarkable you were, might never arrive. Not because you lack value, but because comparison itself requires both things to exist in the same moment, under the same light, measured by the same yardstick, and brains simply don't work that way with the past. The uncertainty they can't resolve. They don't know why you really left. Oh, they have stories, probably a dozen of them, but none of them stick. Was it something they did? Something they didn't do? Were you always planning to leave, or did they push you there? The not knowing gnaws at them in a way that a clean answer, even a painful one, never would. Certainty and closure are not the same thing, but in the weeks after no contact, they blur together into a desperate hunger for something, anything that makes sense. Your silence doesn't fill in the blanks, it multiplies them. Every message unsent becomes a question. Every unanswered call becomes evidence for a different theory. They construct elaborate explanations in the dark. You met someone else. You never really loved them. They bored you. They failed you. Each one briefly satisfying until doubt creeps back in. The mind hates a vacuum more than it hates pain. So it fills the silence with stories, and then it torments itself by not knowing which story is true. This is why they might reach out weeks later, not asking, "Do you miss me?" but asking something smaller, something that sounds casual but carries the weight of everything. They are not looking for romance. They are looking for the one piece of information that resolves the equation. A word, a reason, a confession that you never wanted this. Because once they know, really know, they can stop guessing. They can grieve. They can move on. The uncertainty keeps them suspended between hope and despair, and it is exhausting in a way that certainty, even harsh certainty, never is. Status loss in their social circle. You have no idea how much of your ex's identity was tied to being partnered until you're gone and they realize nobody's asking them to couples dinners anymore. It's not about missing you in those moments. It's about the sudden drop in social currency. The invitation list shrinks. Friends stop asking them to bring the plus one. And if you had a certain status together, that aura leaves when you do. Here's what happens in their mind. They were somebody's person, and that role carried weight. Maybe they were the couple who threw good parties, or the stable pair everyone could count on. Now they're singular again, and singularity in a coupled-off social circle feels like demotion. The group chat still exists, but the tenor changes. People feel awkward. Invitations become conditional. Come if you're feeling up to it, which is code for we're not sure if you fit anymore. This hits especially hard if they were the less charismatic half of the partnership. You might have been the social glue, the funny one, the connector. Without you, they're not invited to things. Friends gradually redirect attention to couples or singles who seem more compelling. It's not malice, it's how social ecosystems work. Energy follows presence. What they're really grieving under this status loss is permission to stay visible, to matter in that specific way, to be chosen. No contact amplifies this because they can't even casually run into people and remind them they still exist. They shrink in their own social world, watching themselves become less important to a community they thought knew them. That particular loneliness stings for months. The mask slipping in private. You know that moment when someone stops texting back and suddenly their Instagram story shows them laughing at a bar with friends? Your brain screams, liar. But what you're actually watching is the mask coming off. When you were there, they had an audience. Not just you, but their own sense of who they were supposed to be around you. The version they showed up as. And now that you're gone, that performance gets to rest. Here's what cuts deeper. They might actually be happier without the weight of that particular role. Not happier without you as a person necessarily, but relieved to stop playing the part you two agreed to play together. The mask slipping doesn't prove they were fake. It proves they were working. Every relationship is a small contract about which parts of ourselves get to show up, which moods get permission, which needs stay quiet. The person you loved was real. The person laughing freely at the bar is also real. Both things exist at the same time. What gets hard to accept is that the freedom they feel in one environment might have meant some constraint in yours. They don't have to moderate their mood for you anymore. They don't have to explain their silence or justify their choices. They don't have to prove you still matter. And that kind of uncomplicated ease can feel like the ultimate rejection. But watch carefully. Sometimes what looks like them moving on brilliantly is actually them rebuilding what any person needs. A life where they're not always performing. The sting isn't that they were fake. It's that you weren't the audience they could fully relax in front of. Anxious attachment activation. When you go silent, their brain doesn't read it as a boundary. It reads it as a threat. Every survival system they have gets loud. Anxious attachment isn't just a preference for closeness. It's a nervous system that learned early that connection is fragile, that abandonment lives one mistake away, and that if you just prove your love loudly enough, maybe this time it'll stick. No contact flips a switch in that wiring. You disappear, and instead of respecting the space, their mind spirals into what therapists call protest behavior. The reaching out, the careful social media checking, the texts designed to pull a reaction. They're not trying to manipulate you. They're trying to regulate their own terror. Their body is screaming that silence means you're gone, and gone means they weren't enough. So they scramble, cycling between rage and desperation, between "I never want to see you again" and "I made the biggest mistake letting you go." Both feel true in the moment because both are coming from the same place: acute nervous system distress. Your consistency during no contact actually wounds them more before it helps. Because you're not reacting, their anxiety escalates. They keep pulling the lever, expecting the machine to work. When nothing happens, something shifts, sometimes weeks, sometimes months later, from urgent to exhausted. That's not healing yet, but it's the beginning. Their nervous system is finally accepting you're not coming back. That safety might have to come from inside themselves instead of from your response. Understanding this doesn't mean breaking no contact. It means knowing what's happening behind the scenes when they do reach out and why they keep reaching. Avoidant deactivation, then panic. When you go no contact, the avoidantly attached person rarely spirals right away. They do something that looks almost peaceful. For the first hours or days, relief floods in. The weight lifts. No demands, no intimacy pressure, nobody asking them to show up more fully. They pour themselves into work, friends, scrolling, their phone lighting up constantly. Whatever keeps that clean, untethered feeling alive. It's clinical in a way that can feel cold. They tell themselves the relationship was draining anyway, that solitude suits them, that you were probably too much all along. They're not lying to you. They're running a script they've genuinely believed for years. But deactivation isn't peace. It's a numbing circuit, and numbness has an expiration date. Around day 3 to day 10, the relief starts to shift. It stops feeling like freedom and starts tasting like void. The distraction loses its grip. A song plays, your name appears. Their body remembers before their brain catches up. Suddenly, the avoidant wakes into a panic they didn't architect, which makes it doubly unbearable. They ended it, so they were supposed to feel nothing. Panic proves they feel something, and losing control of their own narrative is catastrophic. The shame of needing someone they spent weeks minimizing cuts harder than it should, so they fracture. They reach out and retract within an hour. Messages appear that sound rational but are really probes, just checking in, hope you're doing okay. Anything to restart contact without admitting the panic is real. What matters is this: their panic doesn't mean they want you back the way things were. It means the absence is finally undeniable and reality is much louder than the silence they built. The protest behavior stage. 3 weeks in, and they're still not sitting with acceptance. They're doing something louder instead, texting more, showing up, sending money or gifts or long voice notes that sound like live apologies, blasting their life across social media in ways that feel aimed straight at you. None of it's actually about reconciliation anymore. It's protest. Their brain is saying, no, not yet. You can't just leave like this. This stage isn't mature and it's not healthy, but it's deeply human. Attachment doesn't die quietly. When someone rejects the loss they're facing, their nervous system fights back hard. They'll do whatever they can to prove the relationship still exists, to prove you still care, to prove you're still watching from wherever you are. Some will even provoke arguments, accusations, tests of loyalty, because a negative response feels better than the suffocation of silence. At least conflict means you're connected. At least it means they still matter enough to upset you. The protest stage is where they're bargaining with your absence using the only tools they have: access, effort, noise, drama. They might not even know that's what they're doing. They might think they're being romantic or persistent or finally honest about what they feel. But what's actually happening is their attachment system in full rebellion against the loss it can't accept yet. If you're watching this unfold and feeling pulled toward response, here's the hard part. Engagement of any kind feeds this stage. It doesn't shorten it, it extends it. Your compassion here has to wear the shape of stillness, not rescue. That's what actually moves them forward. Your silence is the only mirror that teaches them the story is over, testing whether you'll break first. In the days after you leave, your phone stays quiet, maybe too quiet. Then something arrives, a text that looks casual, a "how are you?" that could have waited, a funny video tagged just for you. Your body knows what this is before your brain catches up. It's not connection, it's a test. They're checking whether no contact actually sticks, whether you're really serious this time, or whether a small enough prod will crack it open. The thing is, they might not even know they're doing it consciously. The part of them that panicked when you left is running the show now, and panic doesn't think, it experiments. It throws something out there and watches to see what bounces back. If you respond, the reward is immediate. You're still theirs to affect. You still care enough to answer. The test passes, and suddenly the quiet breaks and the cycle restarts, except now they know exactly where your breaking point lives. What makes this sneaky is the plausible deniability. They can tell themselves they just wanted to check in, that they weren't trying to manipulate you, they just thought of you. All of that can be true and also completely beside the point because the function stays the same. You either prove no contact is a bluff or you prove it's real. The silence after your non-response teaches them something harder than any explanation. What boundaries feel like from the other side. That unfamiliar feeling is what forces the reckoning. Every time you don't break, you're not being cold. You're being honest in a way they've never had to experience before, and that's when the real work in them starts. Micro-checking your online presence. Your thumb moves faster than your mind one afternoon. Suddenly, you're 3 accounts deep into their followers, looking at who liked a post from last week, checking if they updated their profile picture. You close the app. You feel nothing. Then you open it again 40 minutes later because your brain registered something you almost saw. That loop is the real trap, and it works because each micro-check costs almost nothing, so you tell yourself it doesn't count. One glance at their Instagram, a quick peek at their story, just seeing if they posted anything new. None of these feel like checking on them because they're framed as accidents. Your eyes just happen to land there. But your nervous system knows the truth. Every time you look, you're sending your body a signal that something dangerous is unresolved. You're looking for proof they're fine without you, or proof they're struggling. Either way, you're asking the same question over and over. Am I safe now? The answer never arrives because you're not actually looking for information. You're looking for relief, and no screenshot will provide it. The weight of those microchecks builds in a way that one big stalking session never does, because you never have to admit you did it. You can tell yourself you barely looked, but your nervous system is keeping score. It feels the repetition, the hope, the small spike of cortisol each time you wonder what you might find. Your body doesn't distinguish between one long look and 50 small ones. It only knows that the threat signal keeps returning. The exit here isn't willpower or app deletion. It's changing what just checking means to you, reframing it as the opposite of moving forward, not as a harmless pause. The dignity of your restraint. You know the moment, 3 a.m., phone in hand, a text half written to them that would explain everything. prove something, show them what they're missing. Your thumb hovers. You feel the weight of all the words you're not saying, and it feels like you're drowning. So you think, if I just send this, if I just make them understand, it will release the pressure. But here's what actually happens when you hit send. You hand them power again. They get to read your pain on their own terms, decide how to respond or whether to respond at all, judge your timing, your tone, your emotional state. You become small in that moment, even though you felt urgent. Every message you don't send, especially when you're full of need or rage or proof, is an act of reclamation. It's not silence out of coldness, it's silence out of self-respect. Your restraint becomes the truest evidence of your strength, and they feel it even if they won't admit it. The person who doesn't beg, doesn't explain, doesn't perform their pain, that person becomes harder to ignore, harder to dismiss, harder to keep in their back pocket. What they feel after you leave isn't just longing for you, it's confusion about why you stopped trying to convince them. That confusion is what teaches them slowly, over weeks or months when they're alone. You don't need the last word. You need the last word to stay inside you, locked in your own pocket, where it belongs, alive and undefended. That's the dignity they're noticing now, whether they can name it or not, and it's what stays with them long after the pain fades. Scarcity increases perceived value. You know that feeling when someone stops texting you. Suddenly you think about them constantly, right? The silence creates a kind of hunger. You reread old messages. You wonder what they're doing. The funny part is, when they were always available, always responding, you never felt that pull. The shift from plentiful to rare changes everything in your mind, even though the person didn't change at all. This is how scarcity works on desire. When something stops being easy to access, your brain immediately assigns it more weight, more meaning, more value. It's not a choice you're making consciously. It's wired into how we assess what matters. Limited things feel more important because, in nature, things that disappear fast usually are important. Food when it's scarce, safety when it's threatened, attention from someone we love when they pull away. Your brain reads absence as significance. And here's where it gets tricky. They might be feeling the exact same thing on their end. You've gone quiet, and now they're cycling through those same thoughts, replaying moments, wondering if they made a mistake. The less you're there, the more real you become in their head. Not because you're doing anything special, but because your availability just bottomed out. The paradox is cruel. Fighting for constant contact sometimes erases you from their mind. Disappearing sometimes makes you unforgettable. This doesn't mean you should play games or weaponize silence as a tool, but understanding that your absence naturally increases your value in their perception, that's the real foundation for why no contact actually works at all. You're not punishing them, you're simply letting scarcity do what it does best. The endowment effect of losing you. Remember when someone tried to buy something you owned, maybe an old guitar or a jacket you'd forgotten about, and suddenly the price they offered felt insulting? That's not real economics. That's ownership doing something strange to your brain. The second something becomes yours, your mind inflates what it's worth, not because the thing changed, because you own it. And when it vanishes, the loss hits twice as hard as the gain ever could have. Now think about what that does inside their head. You weren't just another option when you were there. You were theirs. That rewires something fundamental in how their brain values you. Your laugh became irreplaceable. Your texts became little dopamine rewards they learned to crave. Your presence became a baseline that made everything else feel duller. Here's the trap. That inflated value wasn't about who you are in isolation. It was about the fact that you were theirs to keep, to call, to have close. The sharp part happens when you leave. That inflated value doesn't shrink, it compounds. Research keeps showing us that losses feel roughly twice as painful as equivalent gains feel good. So they're not missing you, they're mourning a version of you that their ownership made mythical. The person who left is somehow more perfect, more magnetic, more irreplaceable than the person who was actually there on ordinary Tuesdays. No contact works because it denies them the thing that keeps the myth alive, you being present and human and disappointing them. Without you there to contradict the fantasy, to be messy or ordinary, that fictional version of you sits in their head, getting richer and more unbearable every single day. Eventually, not soon, but eventually, the pain of that phantom becomes so intense that reality starts looking like relief. Rumination loops without new input. The moment you go silent, you don't just disappear. You freeze the story they were still telling themselves, and their brain goes into a kind of sensory starvation. Without new signals from you, without texts or calls or the ordinary friction of your presence, their mind has nothing to do but circle back to what it knows. They replay the last argument in brutal detail, searching for the exact moment the ground shifted beneath them. They imagine phone calls that never ring. They construct explanations you never gave, and each version feels slightly more convincing than the last because there's no you there to contradict it, no fresh reality to update their map. This is what rumination without new input does. It hardens into belief. Without your voice, your laughter, your text offering context or warmth, they fill the vacuum with their own script, and the script writes itself darker each time. A stray comment transforms into proof you never cared. Silence becomes absolute rejection. A kind tone you once used now feels like pity. They're not being irrational here. They're being human, trapped in an isolation chamber, their mind grinding the same groove deeper each lap. The awful part is that the more they think about it, the more real their version becomes, and rumination starts to feel like the only tool they have left. Like if they just think hard enough, they'll find the explanation that makes sense of all of it. They won't. The thing that actually stops the loop isn't a final text or one more explanation or you coming back to defend yourself. It's time and the slow, painful realization that the story doesn't need their ending. But they can't see that from inside the circuit yet. Right now, thinking about you still feels like doing something, like they're still connected. That's the trap, the story they can't complete. You know that feeling when someone leaves a sentence hanging and your brain won't let it go? That's partly what happens to them when you go no contact. You don't just remove yourself from their life. You remove the person they were building a story with, and they're left holding half a narrative they can't finish, can't revise, can't make sense of. The human mind despises unfinished stories the way it despises hunger. So your ex starts spinning alternate endings in their head. You'll come back, you're going through something, you'll eventually see your mistake, maybe you just need space. These aren't delusions, they're your brain's emergency repair kit for the wound of incompleteness. Without an ending, the story stays active, open, consuming energy, and demanding resolution. And here's the trap. No contact doesn't give them the ending they want. It gives them silence, which feels like the cruelest non-ending of all. The story just stops, frozen mid-sentence. So they might reach out, not because they miss you in any way you'd recognize, but because finishing the narrative matters more than what the ending actually contains. A fight, an apology, an explanation, anger, even cruelty, any of those lets them write the end. But silence means the story never settles. It loops. Their mind runs it over and over, filling gaps with whatever feels most hopeful or most believable. The person who can't contact you is living inside an incomplete sentence, and that incompleteness is far more painful than any real ending could ever be. That's why some people push so hard for just one conversation. It's not really about you anymore. It's about their own narrative finally being allowed to close. Weaponized indifference backfires. You've probably tried it. That cold response to a text, the deliberate pause before answering, the practiced tone that says you don't care. It feels like power. It feels like you're taking back control, and for maybe 3 minutes, it works. They notice. They reach out again, but then something shifts and you realize you've been holding your own breath the whole time. Weaponized indifference is a trap wearing a victory costume because the person it harms most is you. Here's what happens in your nervous system. When you practice not caring, your body doesn't know the difference between acting and believing. Your cortisol stays elevated. Your chest stays tight. You're training yourself to stay in a low-level stress response around this person, and that wires your attachment system deeper, not looser. You wanted distance. You got dependency dressed up as control. They might feel rejected, yes, but you feel exhausted. The other person also senses the performance. Rejection mixed with confusion makes them cling harder or spiral into their own games. You're both locked in a dance where nobody's actually communicating. You're just trading wounds. The indifference you performed doesn't create closure. It creates fog. They don't know what you truly want, so they fill the silence with their own story. Maybe you still care and you're hurting. Maybe you're playing games. Maybe you've moved on, but you're cruel. Their nervous system stays dysregulated because they can't read you. Real power looks different. It's not a performance. It's clarity, clean words, honest absence, letting them see a person actually moving forward instead of someone performing distance. When you stop weaponizing and start being genuinely unavailable because you're building elsewhere, they feel that difference in their bones. The recalibration of self-worth. In the weeks after you leave, something shifts that they don't quite have words for yet. Your eyes stop landing on them. Not your judgment, just the fact that someone was watching, registering, keeping score of their small victories and their mess. That attention, even when it felt critical in the moment, had become proof. Proof that they mattered enough to be scrutinized, that someone's world contained them. So when it stops, the silence doesn't feel like peace. It feels like erasure. And because the human brain abhors a vacuum, they fill it with a new story. If you're gone, maybe you were never that impressive. Maybe the version of themselves they showed you wasn't actually impressive. Maybe they've been overestimating themselves all along. Watch how quickly someone can spiral from "they left me" to "I was never good enough." The transition happens not because you told them this, but because they're now the only ones doing the watching. Without your external gaze, they turn inward. And the internal mirror is almost always harsher, more unforgiving, more convinced of their own smallness. They're restructuring how they see themselves, not because of logic, but because the feedback loop has stopped. You were, without knowing it, part of their self-worth machinery. Not in a healthy way, but you were there, present, your attention a small daily vote of confidence. Now they're recalibrating alone in quiet rooms, and the scale always tips toward less than they thought. This is why no contact destabilizes them so deeply. It's not just loss of a person, it's loss of an audience, and the mirror inside grows merciless. Sunk cost keeps them circling. They've already lost years, money, their reputation in some circles, plans they made, inside jokes nobody else would get, the apartment they picked together, that version of themselves they were becoming with you. So when you pull away, their brain doesn't actually do the math that makes sense. It does the math that protects the past investment. If they let you go without one more try, all that loss becomes real, final. It stops being, we didn't work out, and starts being, I wasted that time. So they text at 2 a.m., they show up. They promise change they've already promised before, not because they suddenly love you more, but because walking away means admitting what's already gone is actually gone. They can't let the sunk cost become sunk. It's too loud. Watch this. The longer they were with you, the harder they'll push back. 5 years, they'll circle for months. 10 years, they might circle for years, because the deeper they've poured themselves in, the more their identity got tangled with yours, and the more their ego requires them to believe it wasn't all for nothing. They'll rewrite how bad things were. They'll convince themselves you didn't understand them. They'll hunt for one more conversation that might retroactively justify the time. This is why no contact works. Not because it punishes them, but because distance slowly, quietly makes the old cost feel like ancient history instead of an open wound. Out of daily sight, the sunk cost stops screaming. They can finally grieve what was and move forward. But right now, they can't. They're still negotiating with a loss they're not ready to accept. The hoovering attempt explained, you've been no contact for 3 weeks, maybe 2 months. Radio silence. You're holding it. And then a text arrives, not an apology, not anger either. It's lighter than that. A meme about something you used to laugh about together, or a casual, hey, how are you? As if the last conversation never happened. That's the Hoover, and it's exactly as calculated as it sounds. The term comes from the vacuum cleaner. They're trying to suck you back in, to reestablish contact before you've fully detoxified from the relationship. The genius of the Hoover is that it doesn't demand anything from you. It doesn't ask you to defend yourself or rehash the wound. It just dangles familiarity, warmth, the ghost of how things used to feel. And after weeks of silence, which can feel like abandonment even when you chose it, that ghost can pull hard. You might find yourself reaching back, a simple reply, a heart emoji, one word, just enough to break the seal. Because here's what they're counting on. You don't have to decide if you're getting back together. You just have to stop being gone. Once contact is reestablished, the whole dynamic shifts. Isolation feels colder now that you know they're there, now that reconnection is possible again. The Hoover works not because it's genuine or heartfelt, but because silence breeds doubt, and doubt makes us vulnerable to anything that masquerades as connection. The move that saves you is the hardest one. Recognize the impulse to reply, name it, sit with it, and then don't. The text doesn't need an answer. Your silence was the answer you already gave. And breaking it now just teaches them that silence has an expiration date. It doesn't. Manufactured emergencies to reconnect. You get a text at 2 a.m. Something is wrong. They're upset. Can you call? Your chest tightens. You break silence. Then you're on the phone, untangling a problem that, by daylight, barely exists. This is the pattern that keeps you hooked. They engineer small crises, just urgent enough that ignoring them feels cruel. It's not always conscious, but it works almost every time. The person on the other end of no contact doesn't lose you because they respect your boundary. They lose you because they found a loophole. An emergency doesn't ask permission, it demands presence. A crisis reframes silence as abandonment instead of a healthy distance. So they create them, Whether it's a family drama you've heard 100 times, a health scare that vanishes once you're engaged, a sudden confession about how much they miss you, or a catastrophe that requires your specific help. The genius of this move is that it makes reconnection feel involuntary on your part. You weren't choosing to break no contact. You were choosing not to be a bad person. Not responding to someone in crisis feels impossible, even when you know the crisis is a script they've learned works. The trap deepens because each time you respond, it teaches them the formula works. The next emergency will come sooner, will feel slightly more real because you've validated it. What matters now is recognizing the pattern before your guilt rewrites your own story. When the urgent text lands, ask yourself a ruthless question. Would they be calling me with this if silence actually hurt them, or are they calling because silence is working and they're desperate to undo it? That's not coldness. That's clarity. The breadcrumb text decoded. Your phone buzzes after 3 weeks of silence. A meme. No explanation, no hey, just something they know will land. Your heart does a thing. Maybe they're thinking about you. Maybe the door isn't closed, so you respond, and they're gone again for another 3 weeks. Rinse, repeat. This is the breadcrumb, and it works because it feels like proof. Proof they care. Proof they remember you. Proof that you matter enough to text. But here's what's actually happening. A breadcrumb is communication designed to keep you emotionally tethered without commitment. A small gesture that says, I still want you orbiting, while demanding nothing real in return. The person sending it gets the validation of knowing you'll light up, gets to feel wanted, all without having to show up or explain anything. They're not trying to reconnect. They're keeping a backup. The trap isn't the meme itself. It's that you start interpreting silence as strategy and sporadic contact as affection. You wait. You wonder what they're doing. You craft entire narratives about why they sent it now, what it means for next week, when another might arrive. Your emotional energy is literally following their breadcrumb trail, and they feel that pull every time they check whether you responded. Stop reverse engineering the gesture. A meme is a meme. A breadcrumb means they have a person they contact when the urge strikes them. And right now, that's you. Not because you're special, but because you're available and you respond. The next time one lands, notice the urge to reply fast, to prove you were thinking about them too. Sit with that urge instead. Let it move through you without feeding it. That pause is where your actual power lives. Triangulation through mutual friends. A mutual friend mentions your ex in passing, casually, like a news update. Oh, they said something funny yesterday, or I ran into them at the store. The information arrives wrapped in plausible deniability, not forced. Easy to pretend is accidental, but it rarely is. This is triangulation, using a third party to send you a message when direct contact is off the table. For someone struggling with the loss of access to you, mutual friends become the workaround. They are the delivery system for proof that your ex is still living, still doing fine, still worthy of being in rooms you no longer occupy. What makes it stick in your brain is that it feels harmless. It's just a casual mention, right? But the pattern matters. If the same friend consistently brings them up, if the updates feel timed around your birthday or a milestone, if the tone shifts when they describe your ex versus anyone else, you are watching triangulation happen. Your ex is using your shared connection as a puppet to keep you in their emotional orbit. The thing that catches most people off guard is that the mutual friend often has no idea they are being used this way. Your ex isn't necessarily sitting down plotting. They are simply reaching for the easiest tool to stay in your awareness when you have made yourself unavailable. The move here is unglamorous, but necessary. Gently ask the friend to stop updating you. Not angry, not dramatic, just honest. I'm working on moving forward, and those updates aren't helping. Most real friends respect that immediately. You are not asking them to choose sides. You are protecting your own recovery. Guilt masked as concern. Your phone rings, and you know it's them before you answer. The voice on the other end is soft, careful, just checking if you're okay, if you're eating, if the breakup has worn you down. It sounds so genuinely worried that you almost believe the concern is about your well-being. But listen closer and you'll hear what's actually underneath. They need you to tell them that leaving was a mistake, that you miss them, that the door is still cracked open. That's guilt dressed up as love, and it gets past your guard because it doesn't sound like pressure at all. It sounds kind. You start to wonder if maybe you were too harsh, too quick to cut them off, too unwilling to hear their voice. This is the trap. When guilt masks itself as concern, the person asking isn't really worried about you. They're taking your temperature, looking for a fracture in your resolve where they can start to squeeze back in. Real concern respects a boundary. Real concern doesn't need your reassurance to feel better about itself. When someone disguises guilt as care, they're saying, your pain is uncomfortable for me, and I need you to manage it so I feel less bad. Suddenly, you're responsible for settling an emotional debt that was never yours to carry. The seduction here is real because the tone is gentle, gentler than anger, softer than desperation. It feels like proof they still love you, like maybe the relationship held something good. But love and respecting no contact aren't the same. One wants what's best for you even if it costs them everything. The other wants what's easiest for them, wrapped in the language of care. Learning the difference between those two things might be the most important clarity you build. The apology that seeks access. They break the silence first. After weeks of nothing, your phone lights up with words like, I know I hurt you, and I've been thinking about what I did, and maybe even, I'm sorry. Your chest does something complicated. Relief floods in, but then usually in the second message or buried in the middle of that long text, there's the pivot, the but that softens to a maybe we could just talk, or I miss you, or the careful suggestion that you both made mistakes. What just felt like accountability suddenly smells like a door being unlocked from the inside. Because here's what's actually happening. They are not apologizing. They are renegotiating. The apology is the key, and access to you is the lock. Real remorse doesn't come with conditions or a soft ask to reconnect. It sits with discomfort, says the hard thing, and stops. It doesn't trade an apology for permission to re-enter your life. The blended apology, the one that sounds remorseful but pivots immediately toward restoring contact, hits differently in your nervous system. It feels like they finally get it, like something shifted. That feeling is the trap. Your brain interprets the apology as progress and hears the pivot as vulnerability, when what you're actually witnessing is negotiation dressed as transformation. They need back in, and the shape of their words changed while the direction stayed the same. Watch what comes after the sorry. If the energy shifts toward rebuilding access rather than sitting with the weight of what they did, you're not seeing growth. You're seeing strategy, not always conscious, but strategy nonetheless. The difference lives in that tiny space between the apology and what comes next. And knowing the difference might be exactly what keeps you steady instead of halfway back through a door you closed for a reason. Why they resurface at 2 a.m. 2 in the morning is when the armor falls. During the day, they can tell themselves the story they need, that they're fine, that they've moved on, that you don't matter anymore. But night has a way of pulling the floor out from under those stories. The body gets quiet, the phone feels heavier, and suddenly they're scrolling through old messages or staring at your photo with their chest tight in a way they haven't let themselves feel in weeks. This isn't random timing. Late night is when the brain's default mode network fires up. The part of you that wanders, that replays, that builds narratives without the filter of daylight logic. During those hours, their prefrontal cortex, the part that says don't message them, is offline. The limbic system, emotion, memory, longing, is running the show. Add in sleep deprivation, which tanks impulse control, and you get a person who suddenly feels the full weight of missing you without any protective distance. What makes 2 a.m. so dangerous is that it feels like clarity. They're alone. It's quiet. The world is smaller and more forgiving of their want. They can convince themselves that reaching out is brave or honest, or that you deserve to know how much they regret everything. They rewrite the contact in their head as an apology, a confession, a final goodbye, anything but what it actually is. Loneliness mixed with lowered judgment and the midnight illusion that one message will somehow undo months of silence. They usually don't send it, but they feel it, and that feeling, that raw pull toward the phone, is the real thing pushing them toward the edge of reaching out. The anniversary reaction trigger. 6 months after you leave, they're fine. The rage has cooled. They've made jokes about you. They're texting new people. Then one morning, the exact date you met, or the night you said it was over, their nervous system forgets everything they've done to move on. A song plays, the season shifts, a memory surfaces unbidden. Suddenly, they're back in the grief. Sometimes worse than the first week, and they don't even know why the ground disappeared. This is the anniversary reaction, and it's not weakness or backsliding, it's neurology. Your brain doesn't file memories by logic, it files them by context. A date, a smell, a particular slant of light are involuntary keys that unlock the full emotional weight of what happened, bypassing all the rational work they've done. The nervous system doesn't care that 6 months have passed or that they've moved on. The body remembers. The amygdala remembers. The hormones flood back in as if time never happened. What makes this dangerous is the shame spiral that follows. They feel fine most days, so they believe they're healed. Then the anniversary hits and they feel like day one again, which makes them believe the healing was fake, which makes them angry at themselves for thinking they'd gotten anywhere. Some people use that moment as proof they should reach out. Maybe you feel it too. Maybe the universe is saying something, but the anniversary reaction is just how memory works. It says nothing about whether contact is wise or what it would fix. If they reach out that day, know what's underneath. They're not necessarily reconsidering. They're caught in a neurological current they didn't see coming, and their rational mind is scrambling to make sense of why their body won't cooperate with the story they've been telling themselves. Seasonal memory ambushes, November sneaks up, and suddenly you're standing in a grocery store where the two of you used to fight about what to cook, and your chest goes tight. A song plays. You smell rain like it was in that car. You're 6 months no contact, doing fine, and then spring arrives and every walk feels like a replay of something that never quite finished. This isn't weakness. This is how memory works. it's territorial. Your brain doesn't file experiences by logic or chronology. It files them by sensation, by season, by the exact angle of autumn light. When that trigger arrives, your nervous system doesn't know it's been months. It only knows the season matches, and suddenly you're not remembering them. You're re-experiencing them. What makes this brutal is that you'll feel like you've gone backward. You haven't. You've just walked into a room where the evidence of them is still everywhere, and your body reacts before your mind can translate that into, this is old information, not new danger. The part that catches people off guard is that these ambushes often hit harder than the early grief did, because early grief is sharp and expected. This is ambush. It's the difference between a wave you see coming and one that takes you under from behind. What helps? Know that seasonal cycles will do this. Mark them on your calendar before they arrive. Plan something small that interrupts the old rhythm. A different route, a different meal. Even just knowing Wednesday will be hard takes the ambush out of it. You're not fighting the memory. You're just refusing to let it write your day without your permission. The idealization after devaluation. You left, and now they're remembering you differently. Not as you were in those final months, cold, critical, unavailable, but as you were at the very beginning, the version that made them feel alive. This isn't nostalgia or selective memory. This is a specific psychological flip, and it happens fast, especially if they struggled to see you as human from the start. When someone has always split you into either perfect or ruined, there's no safe middle ground. The devaluation you felt wasn't you changing. It was them recognizing reality and hating it. Now, in your absence, that hatred has nowhere to land. So the mind does what it does best. It rewrites. They scroll through old photos. They remember the way you laughed, not the way you disconnected. They convince themselves that leaving was the problem, not the pattern. And here's where it gets sticky for you. This idealization can look a lot like love from the outside. Friends will tell them to reach out. They might convince themselves that they were wrong about you, that you were right all along, that if only they'd tried harder, you'd still be there. The dangerous part is that this idealization doesn't come with growth. It comes with blame turned inward. They miss the fantasy they created, not the actual person who needed consistency and honesty. When they feel this pull to contact you, and they will, it won't be because they've learned anything. It will be because the pain of absence feels preferable to the discomfort of truth. This is why no contact stays hard for them, not because they love you, because they loved the idea of you, and ideas don't disappoint. Contrast effect against new people. They swipe through an app 3 weeks after you're gone and match with someone whose profile looks solid. Good photos, funny opening message, seems like they have their life together, but something feels thin the moment they start texting. The new person makes a joke that lands okay, just not the way you would have landed it. They suggest dinner somewhere pleasant and forgettable, nowhere near the restaurant you two had that terrible fight about. Nothing is objectively wrong with them. Everything is just less. Your absence has turned you into a measuring stick, and nobody gets to measure well against a memory edited by distance and sharpened by loss. When someone has lived inside the full three-dimensional version of you, the specific way you make your coffee, the rhythm of your laugh, the private jokes nobody else gets, every person who comes next automatically gets stacked against that archive of real experience. The new person isn't competing against you as you are now. They're competing against you as your ex remembers you, filtered through pain and missing, and the particular brightness that absence adds to almost everything. Their brain notices every difference, every moment that doesn't quite click the same way, and the new person loses before they've even had a real chance. It doesn't feel like a trick to your ex. It feels like evidence that what you two had was genuinely special, that they made a terrible mistake. But what they're actually caught in is pure neurology, and it has an expiration date. Usually around 6 to 9 months of real, sustained time with someone new, the contrast begins to fade and reality starts to rewrite itself. Until then, every disappointment with someone new is really just them feeling the space where you used to be. That's not you coming back into their thoughts. That's just how the brain works when it's measuring present against edited past. The realization of your consistency. They promised you inconsistency, 3 weeks of silence, then a text, a month of being strangers, then an apology that arrived at midnight. You learned to brace for the whiplash, the hot, the cold, the I miss you, followed by days of nothing. Your nervous system became a tuning fork for their mood. Were they thinking of you? Would today be one of the reaching out days? And then no contact began, and you stopped performing that exhausting wait. After 40, 50, 100 days of no response from you, something shifts in them. It's not that they miss you, they might, they probably do, but what they're actually up against is the weight of your silence acting like gravity. You don't swing back, you don't soften after 2 weeks, you don't answer their birthday message, you don't check their story. The pattern they relied on, the one where you always bent back toward them eventually, simply stops. And in that stopping, they feel something they might not even have words for yet. The reality that you mean what you're doing. Not as a game, not as a test to see if they'll chase, but as an actual decision. Your consistency becomes a mirror they can't look away from because it proves something about you that contradicts the narrative they built, that you'll always come back, that deep down you're waiting, that one more grand gesture will tip the scales. When you don't flinch, when you don't break, when you stay gone with the same steadiness you said you would, they're forced to reckon with a version of you they might not have thought was possible, the one who actually chose to leave and meant it. Regret's slow arrival curve. Here is what nobody tells you about regret. It does not crash in on day 3 or week 2. It arrives like a guest who keeps ringing the bell later and later into the night. The first weeks after you leave are chaos for them. Anger, relief, numbness, busyness. Their brain is still running the story where you are the problem. But then something shifts. A song, a place they used to see you, a quiet evening where there is actually nothing to do and nobody to blame. That is when regret starts to do its real work. The curve looks like this. Day 1 through day 30, they are defensive. Day 30 through day 90, tiny cracks appear. A text they almost send, a memory that stings. But around day 120, something softens. They start to see their own role. Not all of it, maybe not even most of it, but enough that they cannot unsee it. The thing is, by then, you have already moved on, or you are trying to. Their regret is arriving at a door you are no longer standing at, and this is the secret that breaks people open. They regret what you did, sure, but what really haunts them is what they did, how they responded, what they did not say, how they let anger run the show. The regret is not about losing you. It is about the person they became while losing you. If you are still in early no contact, remember that regret is coming for them, but on its own timeline, not yours. That knowledge alone can quiet the voice that keeps asking if they miss you, the grief they postponed. There's a reason they might reach out to you 6 months from now, or a year, or 3 years. Not because they suddenly miss you or want you back, but because something small cracked them open. A song, a season, a holiday that landed wrong. Your absence was so loud and immediate that it swallowed every other emotion whole. There was no room for sadness about who they became in that relationship, no space for mourning the person they thought they'd be with you. All they could do was rage, defend, minimize, or numb. The grief got packed down like snow under a heavy boot, and heavy snow doesn't melt all at once. It leaks, it seeps, it finds cracks you won't always see coming. This is why they might seem fine for months and then suddenly text you something almost vulnerable. They're not asking to get back together. They're sitting with a version of themselves they haven't let themselves feel yet. The disappointment, the shame about how they treated you, the quiet realization that they wasted time on habits instead of growth. These feelings needed their own grieving process, entirely separate from losing you, but they couldn't access any of it while you were still near enough to blame, to argue with, to use as a distraction from themselves. The anger kept them warm, the fight kept them numb. No contact isn't just about removing temptation from your side, it's about giving them the silent space where their own deferred feelings finally have permission to surface. Whether they do the work or not is theirs to decide, but that potential text isn't chaos. It's their belated honesty, and you don't have to respond to it. Anger as a defense against sadness. You know that moment when someone who hurt you does something small, forgets to text back, goes silent for a day, and suddenly you're furious? Like they owe you the world and they're being deliberately cruel. That fire feels righteous. It feels like power. But if you pause and get quiet with yourself, underneath that fury is often something much softer, the hurt that they could leave, the fear that maybe you weren't worth staying for. Anger is the bodyguard that stands between you and that ache. It's so much easier to be mad than to admit you're broken. When they left, sadness meant admitting the loss was real. Sadness meant sitting with how much you wanted them to choose you and how that wasn't enough. Anger skips all that. Anger says they're bad, they're selfish, they didn't deserve you anyway. See? No vulnerability required. No sitting alone with the truth that someone you loved could walk out. For them, especially in those first weeks after you go no contact, anger can feel like the only sane response. It's motion, it's certainty, it's anything but the quiet, collapsing feeling of, I miss them and it hurts and I can't fix it. So they may rage at you on social media or to mutual friends or to themselves in the car. They're not actually angry about what you did last Thursday. They're angry that the sadness underneath is too big to hold. The real tell is when the anger burns out and there's nothing left but silence. That's when the real grief begins, and that's when they might finally feel what was true all along. Bargaining with an absent person. You know that moment when you catch yourself rehearsing what you'd say to them if they texted tomorrow, how you'd be cooler, calmer, how you'd finally say the right thing? That's not daydreaming. That's bargaining, and it's happening in the silence where they used to be. Your brain is still trying to negotiate with someone who isn't there, proposing deals to a person who can't hear them. Bargaining feels like problem solving because it is, sort of, except the problem isn't solvable. If you could just find the right words, the right timing, the right version of yourself, maybe they'd come back. Maybe the ending wasn't real. So you replay conversations, edit them. Imagine better versions where you were funnier or more vulnerable or less needy. You construct elaborate scenarios where they realize what they lost and suddenly they're trying to reach you. These aren't fantasies exactly. They're negotiations with your own guilt, regret, or powerlessness. The cruelest part is that bargaining keeps you tethered to them at the exact moment you should be building distance. Your energy is still flowing towards someone who isn't reciprocating. It's like texting into a void and expecting an echo back. The real shift happens when you notice yourself doing it, when you catch the mental rehearsal mid-sentence and ask, who am I actually convincing here? The answer is usually just yourself running the same loop over and over. That awareness alone is enough to start turning your attention back toward the people and things that can actually respond, that can actually meet you halfway in real time. The bargaining won't change their behavior. It only keeps your nervous system stuck in negotiation mode, waiting for a response that won't come. The identity void you leave. When you were in their life, you became part of their internal script about who they are, not the footnote kind of presence, but the starring role. They check themselves in the mirror of your attention constantly. The jokes they landed with you shaped which jokes they'd tell. The version of themselves they performed around you became the version they thought was real. You were the audience they'd memorized, the reaction they'd trained for, the person they'd become someone around. And then you weren't there anymore, and what they're facing now isn't quite sadness. It's closer to vertigo. They reach for a comment and suddenly realize there's no one to land it on. They make a plan for the weekend and feel the hollowness immediately because half the point was imagining your response. They catch themselves mid-sentence, remembering the person who would find this funny is gone. That's the void. Not missing you exactly, but missing the reflected version of themselves that only existed in relation to you. In the first weeks, they might thrash for a replacement, someone new, frantic activity, obsessive replays of old conversations, anything to restore that sense of continuity and solidity. But here's what actually matters. That identity void is not the end of something, it's an opening. They can't rewind to who they were before you because you changed their neurology. What they build in that space, whether it's smaller, meaner, or whether they discover something truer underneath all the performed versions, that's entirely theirs now. You didn't erase them by leaving. You just cracked open the illusion that they were ever as solid as they'd convinced themselves to believe. Who am I without their audience? There's a peculiar hollow that opens up when the person you've been performing for walks out. You know the feeling, that moment when you realize you've been curating your life like a show and suddenly the theater is empty. Not because you changed, but because the witness is gone. And that absence forces a question nobody warns you about. Who were you actually being? And who do you become now? For years, maybe decades, your nervous system learned to calibrate itself against their reactions. A joke landed differently depending on their laugh. Your day felt successful or flat based on their approval. You weren't conscious of it most of the time. It's how intimacy feels, right? Someone knowing you. But intimacy and mirrors can look identical from the inside. And when that mirror walks away, you stand in front of yourself and realize you've lost the only script you knew how to read. Here's what makes this doubly strange. The silence isn't your real self finally emerging. It's vertigo. Your sense of identity was stored in their gaze, their reactions, their investment. Without it, you feel like an actor who memorized their lines but never learned to move independently. Some people panic and try to get back on stage. Others just sit quietly in the dark for a while, not sure if they're grieving the audience or finally meeting themselves. The slow work ahead is rebuilding a sense of self that doesn't depend on being witnessed, not narcissism, not isolation, just the quiet knowledge that you exist and matter even when nobody's watching. That's when the real conversation with yourself finally begins. The mirror you stopped holding. Somewhere in the first week after you left, they probably caught their reflection unexpectedly, window, phone screen, store glass, and felt a small jolt of absence. You were a mirror to them, whether you made a conscious choice about it or not. Every laugh you offered, every moment you listened without fixing, every time you believed in them before they could build that belief themselves, that was a constant reflection they consulted like a compass. It whispered that they were worth attention, that their feelings made sense, that they mattered in the way only another person's presence can convince you that you do. Now that mirror is gone. What they're experiencing isn't pure grief. It's a vertigo, as if someone unplugged the lights in a room they'd gotten used to navigating by feel. Without you there to bounce themselves off, they're suddenly forced to rely on their own internal voice. And that voice might be far harsher than yours ever was. The old doubts resurface. The ancient stories about not being enough creep back in. They probably won't realize consciously that this is what's happening. The wiring isn't that transparent. Instead, they reach out with accusations, provocation, or carefully designed chaos meant to pull you back into the role of mirror holder. Because the raw discomfort of seeing themselves without your softening gaze feels unbearable. They're not trying to hurt you, they're drowning in the sudden demand to be their own witness. Understanding this doesn't obligate you to return, but it does explain why their spiral right now isn't really about you leaving. It's them colliding, maybe for the first time, with the work of becoming their own light source, withdrawal from being witnessed. There's a specific kind of quiet that settles in when you're no longer the person someone looks at first, not the dramatic kind of loneliness, the creeping kind, the kind where you catch yourself doing something small, reaching for your phone to tell them, and then remembering there's no them to tell anymore. That ghost reach is withdrawal from being witnessed. For the person left behind, you were the camera. Not in a cruel way, in the most human way. You saw them when they were tired, when they were proud, when they were struggling and trying to hide it. They got used to existing in your attention. Their jokes landed because you laughed. Their insecurities felt manageable because you didn't confirm them. Even their worst moments had an audience that chose to stay. That's intoxicating in the quietest possible sense. When you disappear, it's not just losing a person, it's losing the person they were in front of you. The version that felt real gets no validation now. A win at work feels hollow if there's nobody to care that it mattered to them. A vulnerable moment has nowhere to land. They start performing for an empty room, and the performance becomes exhausting because there's no payoff, no witness, no reflection back. The absence of that reflection is almost physical. This is why they might reappear suddenly, or test the waters, or reach out with something that seems small or casual. They're not looking for reconciliation yet. They're looking for the camera, for proof that version of themselves is still real somewhere, still matters in someone's eyes. When you don't respond, they don't just feel rejected, they feel erased, unmade. The habit of reaching for you. 3 weeks in, they're walking to their car and their hand drifts toward their phone to send you a photo of something stupid. They catch themselves mid-reach. The muscle memory is faster than the brain. This is what silence does. It doesn't erase you, it just makes the absence more textured, more present every time they remember you're not there. They're not thinking about you constantly. They're thinking about you in fragments, at odd angles, when their body expects you before their mind does. The coffee shop where you used to sit, the song you'd mock together, a joke their co-worker makes that would have killed you both. These aren't moments of longing so much as moments of collision, their old life bumping up against their new one. What keeps them reaching over and over is not raw heartbreak. It's habit with a question mark attached. Their brain is still wired to share things with you because that wiring built itself over months or years. Breaking it takes longer than going silent. And here's what they don't say out loud. Part of them doesn't want to break it yet. Reaching for you, even when you're not there, keeps you real in a way that forgetting wouldn't. So they keep catching themselves mid-thought, mid-message, mid-motion, grieving you in real time, tiny death by tiny death, because their nervous system hasn't got the memo that it's supposed to stop. That's what makes no contact so hard for them. It's not that they miss you, it's that their body refuses to. The body has its own timeline, its own demands, and it doesn't always listen to the part of their mind that knows you're gone. Neural pathways starved of contact. When someone you were close to suddenly stops existing in your life, their brain doesn't just file you away like a closed email. The neural pathways that lit up every time they thought about you, heard your name, checked their phone for a message, those pathways are still there, still active, still expecting you to arrive. And that expectation without arrival creates a specific kind of ache that feels almost electrical. Your absence isn't empty space to them. It's a constant small violation of what their nervous system learned to predict. They had you. Their brain built highways for you, shortcuts that made thinking of you as automatic as breathing. Now every one of those pathways fires, but the reward never comes. No text back, no laugh, no presence. That's not nostalgia when they reach for their phone at 3 a.m. That's a neural system in active withdrawal. The tricky part is that those pathways don't fade quickly or evenly. One day they'll go an hour without thinking about you and feel proof they're healing. The next day a song hits and the need is so loud they can barely breathe. That's not weakness, it's neuroscience. It's the same reason an amputee still feels phantom pain in a limb that's no longer there. Your absence lives in their wiring now, and the brain takes time to rewire itself. They're not trying to get over you. Their nervous system is literally learning how to function without the stimulus that had become essential. Until that rewiring happens, every notification sound, every silence, every moment they almost reach for you, all of it hurts with the intensity of something real being taken away. The extinction burst before quitting. Picture a vending machine that's never let you down. You press the button 1,000 times and every time, snack. One day you press and nothing happens. You don't walk away. You press harder, faster, trying different buttons. Maybe you bang the glass. You're not thinking anymore. You're just escalating the old move that always worked. That frantic surge of effort when the reward stops coming is called an extinction burst, and your ex is doing exactly that with contact right now. They text more. They show up at your door. They call from different numbers, slide into your DMs through burner accounts, send messages through mutual friends. They cry, rage, promise they've changed, threaten to vanish forever. The sheer intensity of it can feel like proof that you matter, that this was real, that pulling away was a mistake. It's not. It's the death throes of a pattern, not its resurrection. Here's what makes this brutal. The burst usually peaks around 2 to 4 weeks in, exactly when you're worn down and most vulnerable to caving. They feel the old leverage slipping and panic floods in. They throw everything, every tender memory, every threat, every button combination they think will unlock you. And you sit there wondering if your silence is cruelty, if their desperation is actually love in disguise. It's neither. It's a behavior in its final, loudest convulsion before it dies. The machine is broken. They're checking one more time to be absolutely certain. The hard truth is that the burst ends faster when nothing feeds it. Don't put another coin in. That's when the real silence arrives, the kind that means you've already won. Why the burst signals progress. You text them at 2 in the morning and they don't respond. You text again 3 hours later, nothing. Then 4 days pass, radio silence. And suddenly, out of nowhere, they're in your inbox with 5 messages in rapid fire, each one longer than the last. Some apologies, some anger, some vulnerability that catches you off guard. That burst, that sudden flurry after weeks of quiet, feels like a breakthrough, like they finally broke and thought of you. But here's what's actually happening. It's not progress. It's a crack in their no contact resolve, and there's an important difference. When someone goes silent, they're rebuilding their nervous system. It's slow work. Day after day, the urge to reach out gets smaller. The story they tell themselves about you gets quieter. Their brain is rewiring, unlearning the addiction loop. But somewhere around day 10 or 15 or 25, something triggers the old circuit. A song, a photo, genuine regret, or just a moment where the quiet feels unbearable. The dam breaks. Suddenly, the dopamine hits again, and they flood the channel with everything they've been holding back. This burst often feels meaningful to the person on the receiving end because it looks like hunger, like they miss you desperately. And maybe they do, but for them, that burst is actually a setback. It's proof the loop still has teeth. If they're serious about healing, they'll recognize this moment for what it is, a relapse, not a milestone. Your job stays simple. Don't treat the burst like something shifted. It means the opposite. Their silence is the real work. The burst is just the system pulling them backward. The false recovery plateau. 3 weeks pass, then 4, and you don't reach for the phone. The house feels quieter now. You stop refreshing their feed. One morning, you wake and realize you didn't think about them until after lunch, and something shifts. Not joy exactly, but ground beneath your feet. So you ease up. Maybe you text them. Maybe you just tell yourself the hardest part is done, and then it collapses the same way a building falls, not when the first crack appears, but when you stop watching it. Your nervous system gets tired of staying vigilant, so it fakes a finish line. The false recovery plateau is what you feel when exhaustion dresses itself up as peace. You do feel better, the acute panic is gone. But that's not healing, that's just your body borrowing rest from a place it hasn't finished grieving. This moment is when people relapse hardest because they believe they've arrived. But they're actually in a dangerous middle zone where the sharp pain has dulled just enough to make the old pull feel reasonable again. Your brain isn't wired to suffer forever, so it gets bored with the pain and whispers that maybe one conversation would feel good. Maybe they've changed too. That whisper is louder on the plateau than in the early desperate days because it comes dressed as wisdom instead of hunger. The plateau isn't proof you've healed. It's proof your nervous system needs rest. But rest is not resolution. Real healing often starts the moment you stop feeling frantic about it, because that's when you're finally steady enough to actually grieve instead of just survive. Projection of their fear onto you. Watch what happens the moment you're gone. They're terrified of abandonment, so they flip the script and decide you're the one who abandons people. They're afraid of being alone, so they recast you as cold and incapable of real connection. They're panicked that nobody will ever want them, so they reshape you into someone shallow, someone who only wanted surface things anyway. None of this mirrors what you actually did. It mirrors what they're running from inside themselves. When you walk away clean, you become a mirror they can't bear to look into, so they smash it and tell mutual friends the glass was always ugly. The projection does something essential for them. It swaps fear for blame. Suddenly, they're the wronged party instead of the architect of their own isolation. But here's where it locks in tight. The more they project, the harder they grip it. They replay conversations and hear cruelty in your tone that was never there. They rewrite shared memories, bending them until nothing fits anymore. Your silence becomes proof of indifference. Your moving forward becomes proof you never cared. Your peace becomes proof you were always cruel. None of that rewrites what actually happened between you two. Not one single detail. The shift is quieter than that. You know the truth of it. You don't need to defend it or explain it or convince them otherwise. That internal knowing, that certainty about your own heart and your own intentions is what keeps you steady when they're drowning in their projections. They're fighting a version of you that exists only inside their fear. You're not that person. Let them keep fighting that ghost, assuming you feel what they feel. You're 3 weeks into no contact and a thought arrives unbidden. They must be falling apart too. Maybe they're checking your old photos at midnight. Maybe they wake at 3 a.m. replaying conversations. Maybe they're as untethered as you are right now, staring at ceilings. It feels like math. If you hurt this much, they hurt this much. But that equation comes from a single faulty assumption baked into how your brain wants to work, that their nervous system runs on the same frequency as yours. It doesn't. The person who left you may feel relief spreading through their chest where you feel devastation. They may feel guilty where you feel abandoned and angry. They may feel nothing at all or something so different from your pain that if they told you the honest truth about it, you wouldn't even recognize it as sadness. This isn't cruelty, it's just neurology. People process loss differently based on attachment styles, childhood wounds, whether they initiated the break, how they're wired for connection, and 100 invisible factors you'll never have access to. Your brain wants to believe in symmetry because symmetry would mean you matter equally, that the impact is mutual, that the whole story makes sense and balances. But the hardest part of no contact isn't knowing what they're doing. It's accepting that what they're feeling might be completely unrelated to what you're feeling. They could be lighter than air while you're underwater. And that's not because you loved wrong or failed, but because you're two separate people living in two separate emotional universes now. The quiet gift, if you can find it, is that their silence stops being about you the moment you stop translating it into your own language. The empathy gap in absence. When you leave, they don't feel what you feel, not because they don't care, but because your absence hits them in a completely different way than their absence hits you. You're rebuilding, moving forward, feeling the weight lift. They're stuck in a loop of unanswered questions, replaying conversations, wondering if they should text, scrolling to see if you've moved on. The silence you needed feels like punishment to them. The space you created to heal becomes rejection they caused. Two people, one boundary, two entirely different internal worlds that never touch. Here's what sharpens it. They're not imagining a version of you moving on. They're imagining a version that's angry, thriving without them, proof they weren't enough. You might be grieving or genuinely indifferent, but they can't access that. They only have the mirror of your absence. And to someone desperate for contact, absence always looks like evidence. Evidence that you meant it. Evidence that you're done. Evidence that you never needed them the way they need you. Every day you don't text becomes another brick in the wall they're building inside their head. The gap widens because you can see your own reasons for leaving, the exhaustion, incompatibility, the slow death of it. But they're constructing meaning from silence, from your unavailability, from the life you're living without narrating it to them. They feel abandoned in a way you might not even recognize because you're not there to see it. That invisibility of their pain is what keeps some people stuck for months, cycling through anger and hope, unable to move because they haven't heard you say the words goodbye directly to them, face to face, in a way their nervous system can finally register as real. Overestimating your suffering. 3 days in, you're calculating how many years of this feeling you have left, convinced you're the exception to how human pain actually works. Your brain is running a prediction on flooded data. It's like judging an entire movie after watching the darkest 10 minutes on loop. The pain is absolutely real, but right now your nervous system is still drenched in cortisol and adrenaline, and you've lost access to the small counterbalances that kept your mind steady, the inside jokes, the casual touch, their voice saying your name in that particular way. Without those anchors, your threat detection system invents a story where this becomes permanent, where you're the broken exception to human resilience. Because the suffering feels so enormous in this moment, it seems impossible that it could ever shrink. But your flooded brain can't quite see what's actually true. The acute phase, this raw, all-consuming thing, has a shelf life. Not because you're weak or because you'll forget them, but because your system eventually recalibrates. You'll wake up one morning and they won't be your first thought. You'll laugh at something and realize you weren't split between the moment and the loss. These shifts don't announce themselves on a calendar you can predict, but they do happen. The suffering you feel right now isn't a permanent address. It's more like a storm surge, real and terrible, and reshaping everything, but not the ocean itself. The ocean returns. You return. That future version of you who can hold this memory without drowning is already forming somewhere in the neurological dark, even though present. You can't quite feel them yet. Your job right now isn't to believe that, just to not fight it when small evidence appears. Underestimating your relief. A few weeks into no contact, you notice something odd. You're laughing at things again. A text from a friend lands differently. The kitchen feels quieter in a way that doesn't ache anymore, and then you catch yourself and feel guilty, like you're not supposed to feel this good yet, like feeling light is somehow disloyal to the pain you're supposed to carry. So you pull back. You remind yourself of the hard parts. You replay the hurt to keep yourself honest. What you're doing is downplaying your own relief, and it's one of the quietest ways people sabotage their own healing. The guilt is real because relief can feel like betrayal when you've been conditioned to believe that loving someone means suffering indefinitely, means staying small and apologetic and always ready to explain yourself. But here's what's actually happening beneath that guilt. Your nervous system is finally getting what it desperately needed: safety, space, predictability, room to breathe without bracing for the next rupture. The relief isn't a sign you didn't care or that your love was shallow. It's a sign you're starting to believe you deserve to feel okay, that your body's comfort matters. When that lightness shows up and the shame whispers that you're being cold or ungrateful, try something radical. Stay with the relief. Don't explain it away or justify it backward or rehash the pain to prove you were hurt enough. Your body isn't lying to you. It's healing. The guilt about feeling better is just the old story trying to keep you small, trying to convince you that you have to earn peace through continued suffering. You don't. The control they lost over you, they knew exactly how to move you. A text at 2 a.m. and your chest would tighten. A single word, "We need to talk," and you'd scramble to fix whatever imaginary breach had opened. They had learned the precise angle of withdrawal that made you chase, the timing of breadcrumbs that kept you orbiting. For years, maybe, you were predictable, you were legible, you were controllable. Then you left, and that whole map of you became useless. They cannot reach in and pull the lever anymore. No matter what they text, you do not respond. No matter how they frame it, anger, charm, crisis, memory, jealousy, the machinery does not turn. And that absence of response, that refusal to perform the old dance, registers not as freedom on their end, but as a total loss of power. It is not sadness you are causing them. It is helplessness. For someone whose identity was built partly on being able to move you, control you, predict you, this is a kind of small death. They may spiral trying to find the right combination again, the right words, the right story, the right pressure point, because their whole self-image depends on being able to affect people. The silence you keep is not punishment to you. To them, it reads as proof that they no longer matter, that you have become untouchable, and that thought can eat at someone far more than genuine rejection would. Your refusal to bend becomes a mirror they cannot look away from. Understanding this does not mean you owe them a response. It means you recognize what your quiet is actually doing on the other side, and why they may be more frantic, not less, the longer you stay gone. Silence as the ultimate boundary. Watch what happens the moment you stop responding, not out of anger or strategy, but because you've noticed that every word you offered, even the painful ones, was proof you still existed in their orbit. Your voice became currency. Your explanations became material they could work with, parse, argue against, reshape, and the second you go quiet, something shifts in them that no argument ever touched. Silence doesn't punish. It announces that the transaction has closed. They can't bargain with nothing. They can't negotiate with air. What destabilizes someone used to controlling the narrative is that silence offers no surface to push against, no heat to spin, no logic to untangle, no reassurance to misuse. An angry response gives them engagement. A long explanation gives them ammunition. But silence says, I'm not here to be managed. I'm not available for this anymore. That absence becomes louder than anything you could have said out loud. For you, this quiet is not coldness. It's self-preservation wearing a different face. It's the boundary that requires zero maintenance because it makes zero promises. You don't defend it, explain it, or soften it with reassurances. The silence does that work. What they do with that void reveals everything your presence never could. Whether they respect it, rage against it, slowly accept it, or spiral trying to fill it, that answer arrived at in perfect stillness is often the most honest thing a relationship ever offers. Their reaction to your absence tells you what your voice never managed to, why explanation would give them power. You know that urge to explain yourself, right? The one where you're sitting in silence and thinking about all the things you could say, the context they missed, the way they misunderstood, the reasons behind what you did. It feels urgent, like if they just understood, something would shift. But here's what actually happens when you break no contact to explain. You hand them the one thing they've been secretly starving for, which is proof that you still think about them, that they still matter enough to warrant your words, that there's still a conversation to be had. Explanation is an invitation. It says, come back, let's talk about us. And in their nervous system, that registers as a door opening. Even if your explanation is firm or angry, the act of explaining is engagement. And engagement is the exact hook they'll use to pull you back in or tell themselves you're not really gone. They don't need you to explain your reasons. They need you to stop confirming their relevance by responding at all. The silence, the absence of explanation, the refusal to defend or clarify, that's what communicates that something has ended. It's harder than talking because talking feels like love, even when it's supposed to be goodbye. The quietest form of respect you can give a broken dynamic is to let your actions speak without commentary. Explanation wraps itself in hope and hands them a thread to pull. In no contact, you're not withholding cruelty. You're withholding the fuel that keeps them waiting, the signal that you're still tethered to the outcome, the proof that they still live rent-free in your mind enough to break your own boundary. The information starvation tactic. Right after you disappear, they seem fine for a few days. That calm is the lie. Under the surface, they're scrambling for any scrap of information about you, checking your socials, reaching out to mutual friends, replaying old conversations for hidden meanings they might have missed. You've created a vacuum, and humans are wildly uncomfortable in vacuums. We fill them with stories, catastrophizing, obsessive searching. The silence from you doesn't feel like respect or space. It feels like being locked out of someone's life entirely. What makes this worse is they can't even be sure if you're angry, moving on, rethinking the relationship, or just done. That uncertainty activates the worst part of their brain, the part that whispers, "If I only knew what they were thinking, I could fix this. If I could just get one message through, I could explain myself." So they construct elaborate theories about what you're feeling, each one riddled with hooks, shame, regret, hope, rage, confusion about whether they'll ever hear from you again. This is where some people begin to crack under the weight of their own speculation. They send a message. They call from a new number. They find a way to prove they exist to you because the information starvation is unbearable. They've built a prison inside their head and they're desperate for parole. Here's what matters. Your silence doesn't actually protect you from them. It protects them from themselves. The less you give them, the more their own mind becomes their captor, spinning theories and replaying moments until reality dissolves into noise. That's not punishment. That's just how we're wired. Knowing that doesn't mean you should break silence. It means you should know exactly why breaking it would only restart everything. Curiosity as a psychological itch. Think about the last time you didn't know something and couldn't let it go. Your ex's new relationship status, whether they've been checking your profile, what they said about you to their friends. That gnawing feeling, that pull toward information you don't have, that's not weakness or lingering love. That's curiosity doing what it evolved to do. Keep you alive by reducing uncertainty. Your brain hates gaps. A gap is a potential threat, so it itches until you scratch it. And here's the trap that gets people on no contact. The itch is real, but the scratch makes it worse. You check their Instagram. You get a hit of novelty, a tiny dopamine burst from new information. Your brain notes this. It learns that scratching works, so the itch comes back faster, itchier, more insistent. You're training a cycle. The person who's left isn't tormented by missing you in some romantic way. They're tormented by not knowing. Did you move on? Are you struggling? Did you say anything about them? That uncertainty is actually painful, neurologically painful. It activates the same regions as physical threat. So they might check your social media, ask mutual friends, show up places they think you'll be, not because they want you back necessarily, but because their brain is screaming that the gap is unbearable. The move here isn't to satisfy the curiosity, It's to sit with the itch. Let it be there without scratching. This sounds impossible, but every time you don't check, you're rewiring the urgency. The itch loses its teeth, and when they feel the same pressure building, if no information comes, something shifts. The uncertainty gets boring. The gap closes not with answers, but with acceptance. The open loop in their mind. Your absence didn't close a chapter for them. It froze the story mid-sentence. That's the open loop, and it's neurologically uncomfortable in a way that active conflict never quite is. When something is unresolved, incomplete, left hanging, your brain keeps trying to finish it. You know that itch when a song cuts off before the final note. Multiply that across every conversation you never had, every explanation they never got, every future you implied but didn't confirm. That loop stays spinning. Their mind keeps returning to it because loops pull attention like gravity pulls water. They'll replay moments for hidden clues. They'll construct conversations that could have happened. They'll imagine you somewhere living differently without them, and that image itself is incomplete, so the loop keeps searching for resolution. What makes this particular torture is that they can't satisfy it. You're not there to answer the questions their mind keeps asking. You're not there to finish the sentence, so they'll manufacture scenarios instead. They'll check your social media, hoping a photo or timestamp will close the loop by proving you're fine without them, which somehow would be worse and still wouldn't close it. They'll play out reconciliation fantasies that do nothing but restart the loop. They'll swing between they're thinking of me and they've forgotten me entirely because neither feels like an actual ending. Here's what matters. The open loop isn't weakness on their part. It's how a brain works when data is missing. Your job isn't to close it for them by reaching out with explanations. Letting it remain open, uncomfortable, and unanswered is what eventually teaches them to live with silence. Cognitive dissonance about your worth. They spent months or years telling you that you mattered. Late night talks where they said you were the one, plans they made because you were in them, and then they left. So now their brain has a genuinely unsolvable problem. The person they claim to love deeply is gone, and they were the one who chose to walk away. That contradiction sits heavy. The mind despises holding two truths at once, that you were worth everything and also worth leaving. Something has to give. Watch what happens in the weeks after no contact begins. Suddenly, you weren't what they thought you were. You had hidden edges they didn't see before. You were harder to love than they realized. The late night talks they treasured start feeling suffocating in their memory. The way you showed up for them gets reframed as neediness. Not because any of it is true, but because it's the only way their self-image survives intact. They need to believe they made the right call, and believing you were genuinely worth it makes that doubt creep in. Here's what cuts. They're not lying to you anymore. They're lying to themselves with the kind of total conviction that almost looks like certainty. They've rewritten your entire presence into something smaller, more flawed, more dismissible. And they'll defend that version with real emotion because doubting it means doubting who they are. The trap you have to watch for isn't their rewrite itself. It's when you start absorbing it as fact. Their need to shrink you doesn't make you smaller. Your worth doesn't depend on their ability to hold it steady when pressure gets unbearable. Stay rooted in what actually happened between you, not in what they tell themselves now. Justifying the loss to save face. 2 a.m. and they see you've unfollowed them, or worse, that you're thriving. That hot spike of shame hits, and something in the brain flips. The person they miss becomes the person they're suddenly angry at, not because anything new happened, but because losing you is unbearable, and anger is so much easier to wear than grief. So they start collecting evidence. That time, you were selfish. The conversation where you weren't listening. The way you always made it about yourself. Suddenly, they have a narrative where you were the problem, and they're not grieving a loss. They're dodging a bullet. This isn't lying to you, it's lying to themselves, and they have to make it stick because if they don't, the loneliness wins. What sharpens this is that some of the evidence might even be real. You weren't perfect. Nobody is. But they're selecting which memories matter, emphasizing the fights while minimizing the quiet mornings and inside jokes and the way you looked at them. They're building a case because being left hurts far less than admitting they made mistakes that cost them you. And here's where you come in. You can't argue them out of the story. Trying to remind them of the good times or pointing out that they're rewriting history only proves to them that you don't understand what they're protecting. The fragile belief that they're fine without you, that this was inevitable anyway. Let them have their narrative. It doesn't change what was real between you. It just means they need to believe something else right now to survive the quiet, and sometimes that belief is what keeps them from calling at 3 a.m. The devaluation reversal. A text arrives at an odd hour, or you catch them liking something old, and suddenly the person who carved you into a monster is treating you like the one that got away, the real thing they threw aside, the person they should have held onto. It feels like vindication, like finally they see you. But what's running underneath is the exact same mechanism that crushed you in the first place, just pointed the other direction. The devaluation was never about who you actually are. It was a story they needed to tell themselves, and now they're rewriting it. Maybe they're lonely. Maybe the new situation crumbled and nostalgia tastes better than whatever's in front of them now. Maybe they're in a season where they need to believe they lost something precious. The reversal feels like it could heal the wound the devaluation made, like their changed mind could restore you to real again. But watch what that trade costs. Your worth becomes dependent on their estimation once more. Before you were nothing, now you're everything. Both extremes keep you as a character in their internal movie, not a person with fixed value that exists whether they're watching or not. The mind that could discard you completely has the same mechanism that lets them suddenly reclaim you, an instrument that edits you according to whatever story serves them next. When they soften, it's usually not clarity or real forgiveness. It's revision. If they reach out, you'll feel the pull to believe the reversal proves something was true all along. Let that feeling move through you without gripping it. Your worth survived the devaluation untouched. It never needed their changed mind to make it real. Sudden remembering of your value. Weeks or months into no contact, they're sitting alone, scrolling maybe, or just staring at nothing in particular, and suddenly something surfaces that has nothing to do with self-torture or obsession. They remember that laugh you have, the way you moved through hard moments without falling apart, how you had plans before the relationship, standards that actually mattered to you, a life that wasn't built around waiting to be proven worthy or seeking permission to exist. And in that moment, the quiet hits differently than it ever has before. It's not loneliness creeping in. It's the shock of recognizing they lost someone who actually had real value, not a character they could reshape into something more convenient, or a person stuck in some holding pattern waiting to be fixed. You were already worth knowing, and that clarity arrives like cold water. This is exactly when their inner narrative starts to fracture, even if only in silence where no one else can see it. They'd built a story where you were the one needing to change, the one lucky to have them in your orbit. But time and distance do something peculiar. They return clarity about who you actually were beneath all the projection and need. They confront it quietly. They let someone real leave. Not perfect, real. Someone with genuine life, with dignity intact, with things to offer the world that had nothing to do with their approval. That discomfort can push them toward reaching out or sit inside them like a small stone for years. Either way, somewhere in their slow reconstruction of what happened, they're beginning to see what was there all along, a person worth knowing. And they're no longer certain they have any right to that knowing anymore. The competitor's arrival panic. You've been gone 3 weeks and you're doing okay. Not great, but steady. Then one night, they text a photo of themselves at dinner with someone new, and suddenly your chest tightens like you can't breathe. It's not grief anymore, it's dread. The person you left is now someone else's person, and your brain reads that as a catastrophe you didn't see coming. This is the competitor's arrival panic, and it hijacks your entire nervous system because you've just lost something you didn't know you still needed, the fantasy that they might wait. As long as they were alone, some part of you believed your exit meant something. It kept you special, even in leaving. But a new person erases that narrative. Now you weren't the one who mattered most. You were just the one who left before someone better showed up. The timeline doesn't matter. The fact that you chose to go doesn't compute. What hits is pure territorial threat, the ancient sense that you've been replaced, outcompeted, forgotten faster than you deserve. Here's the thing, this panic doesn't mean you want them back. It means you want them to want you back, which is a completely different animal. It means the door closing quietly is less painful than watching them step through a new one with someone else. And if you're scrolling their pages or asking mutual friends for updates, you're trying to reopen that door in your head before it locks completely. The only real move is to step back from the feed, the stories, the updates, not because they owe you anything, but because watching their next chapter live will keep you trapped in your old one, frozen in the moment before they found someone new. Territorial instinct reawakened. You left, and suddenly they noticed things they never saw before. The way your coffee cup sat on the shelf, the indent in the pillow, the route you walked to the kitchen at 2 a.m. None of this mattered when you were there. Now it's everywhere. What's happening is primal, and it's brutal. Your absence has activated their territorial brain. When someone loses you, they don't just lose you as a person, they lose you as a marker. You were a living flag planted in their territory, proof that this space, this life, these routines belong to them. Without you, the landscape feels invaded, or worse, abandoned. They roam the rooms looking for your ghost. Sometimes they find it. Sometimes they sleep on your side of the bed, not because it smells like you, but because it's the only place that still feels claimed. And here's what makes it vicious. This territorial response isn't nostalgia or love in disguise. It's ownership waking up. Your absence becomes a wound to their sense of possession. They might contact you under the guise of missing you, but what they're really doing is checking the fence line, testing if you're still theirs, if the border still holds. If you're no contact and you see this, them suddenly caring about shared spaces, commenting on how empty things feel, trying to pull you back into shared territory, understand that they're not necessarily regretting the loss of you. They're regretting the loss of themselves as someone who mattered enough to claim something. That's a different thing. And it's often what drives the most persistent hoovering, the desperate need to repaint the territory with your presence again. Jealousy without ownership rights. There's a peculiar rage that lives in people after a breakup. They've moved on publicly, maybe they're seeing someone new, but the moment they catch wind that you're happy with someone else, something cracks. They didn't want you. They want the version of you that exists only for them. That's the whole architecture of it. Jealousy without ownership rights is a ghost pain in a limb you already severed. It's the feeling of losing something you explicitly chose to throw away, and that contradiction creates a kind of cognitive fury that has nowhere to land except back on you. When they were with you, your attention belonged to both of you. You could be seen by others, loved by others, but there was always the agreement. The primary real estate was theirs. No contact removes that. Suddenly, you're a full person living for someone else, and they're experiencing that as a theft, even though they're the one who left. What makes this especially corrosive is that they can't admit the jealousy without admitting they still want you, which wounds the new relationship they've built or the image they've created. So instead, the jealousy metastasizes into judgment. Your new partner is wrong for you. You've changed. You're making a mistake. All of it is the feeling of being replaced, filtered through denial. The quiet cruelty here is that their jealousy isn't really about you anymore. It's about the loss of their own power, the position they no longer hold. And that's exactly when you need to stay unreachable. Their pain about what you're doing next isn't a sign you should reconsider. It's proof the boundary is working exactly as it should. The fantasy of your return. Every few days, usually late at night or during some moment when the day feels hollow, they construct the same scene with tiny variations. You walk back in, you finally understand what you lost. You apologize, or they apologize, or you both just collapse into each other and every hard thing dissolves. Sometimes you show up because you read a song that made you think of them. Sometimes you arrive because you realized you were wrong. Sometimes you are just there, and that's enough. The fantasy doesn't stay the same either. It gets refined, polished, made more convincing each time they run through it, like a movie they've watched so many times they could narrate it backward. What makes this grip so tight is that while they're inside it, the fantasy doesn't feel like delusion. It feels like the most logical prediction of how things will actually go. After all, you left once before and came back. You said you needed space and meant it for a month, then called. You said it was over, but you still like their photos. The pattern is there to point at, so the fantasy isn't hope, it's pattern matching. It's their brain saying, here is the data, here is what happens next. This is why no contact works. Not because they stop thinking about you, they won't, not for months. But because each day you don't return makes the fantasy harder to defend. The refinement stops. The rehearsal starts to feel less like prediction and more like what it actually was, a story they told themselves to survive. Reality, silent and consistent, gradually becomes more persuasive than the script. Rehearsing the reunion conversation, you've done it 1,000 times in your head. The conversation where they reach out, where they finally say the thing and you know exactly what you'll say back, how calm you'll sound, which words will land hardest. In your mind, it's perfect. You're collected, wise, unbothered. The real version never looks like that. Here's the trap. When you script the moment over and over, you're not preparing your nervous system for flexibility. You're training it to expect a specific performance. Your brain gets wired into that scene until it feels like the only version that exists. So when they text something slightly different, something you didn't account for, the whole carefully built tower wobbles. The rehearsed version is almost always you at your most offended, you winning, being rational while they crumble. But an actual reunion won't be a performance to win. It'll be two people who lived in each other's heads colliding with unpredictable presence, messy and charged and nothing like the script. Your practiced version has no space for you to actually feel something new in the moment, to be surprised by what you want, to hear something that shifts the whole frame. What matters now isn't perfecting the words, it's staying loose enough to respond to what's real when it arrives. Rehearsal creates rigidity, and the moment they show up, rigidity breaks. The person you've been imagining is not the person who will walk in. The armor of a script feels like protection, but it's really a cage built around you. Maybe the real strength isn't in having all the lines ready, it's in being grounded enough in yourself that you can handle the mess without needing to control how it sounds. Let yourself be a little unprepared. Trust that you can handle what shows up. Preemptive defensiveness they build. They know you're gone, and before you even try to come back, they've already rehearsed the rejection, locked themselves into a story they can control. You were selfish, you didn't understand them, you were never really committed. Sounds backward, but it's strategic. If they decide first that you're the problem, then your absence becomes proof of their narrative instead of a wound that needs healing. When you left, you handed them the materials to construct a defense, and they worked fast. Preemptive defensiveness is the armor they forge before you knock on the door again, because reaching out to you again means risking that maybe, just maybe, they were part of what went wrong. That's too costly. So instead, they pour energy into reasons why contact with you would be settling, why you'd only hurt them again, why staying no contact is their choice, not your absence. Every day without you becomes evidence they're right to keep you out. And here's what makes this dangerous. The defensiveness hardens over time. It doesn't stay a shield they're consciously holding. It becomes the actual architecture of who they are now, real to them in ways that matter more than memory. Their identity fuses with the wall. When you do reach out, that barrier doesn't soften because you've had good intentions or because you're genuinely trying. It stiffens because you're testing something they've spent weeks or months cementing into place, and they need that story intact more than they need you. They're not rejecting you in that moment. They're protecting the person they've decided to become. That weight you're carrying when they don't respond, it's not about you at all anymore. The self-serving memory bias. You had a fight 3 months ago. You remember standing there, calm and reasonable, pointing out their flaws with surgical precision. They got defensive. They yelled. They always yelled when they lost. Now compare that memory to what actually happened, because if they're telling their version of that same night, they remember it almost entirely differently. They remember you being the one who raised your voice first. They remember trying to be rational while you spiraled. And here's the brutal part. They're not lying. They're remembering, just not the same fight you're remembering. This is the self-serving memory bias in full bloom. Your brain doesn't record events like a camera. It edits. It cuts the unflattering angles. It brightens the moments where you were right, dims the moments where you were cruel, and sometimes erases entire scenes where your behavior was hard to defend. We all do it. The guy who cheated remembers himself as going through a rough patch and seeking comfort. The woman who left him remembers him as selfish and unable to handle his own emotions. The trap is thinking your version is the truth. It feels true. It's written in your nervous system now, locked into a story your ego signed off on. But if you're no contact with them and replaying old fights in your head, know that you're not remembering the fight. You're remembering your memory of the fight, which is a much smaller and much more curated thing. The real lesson isn't about winning old arguments in your head. It's recognizing that both of you left that relationship with completely different wars inside your skulls. That gap between versions is where most of the pain lives. Blame decays over time. When you first cut contact, everything they did feels carved in permanent stone. You replay their words, their betrayals, the specific ways they failed you, and each memory lands like fresh evidence for a case you're building in real time. Blame is hot then. It has teeth. It keeps you awake at 3 a.m, makes you rehearse the wreckage to anyone who will listen. But here's what research finds over and over. That white-hot certainty about who ruined what doesn't actually hold its shape. The neural pathways that fire together when you're furious, the ones locking your memory to their specific cruelty, they fire less often as time passes. The story stays the same on the surface, but the emotional charge attached to it gets quieter, like a song playing in another room. 6 months from now, you'll remember what they did. You might even remember feeling betrayed, but the feeling itself will have lost some of its voltage. A year in, you'll notice neutral space around the memory that wasn't there before. Not forgetting, not deciding they were right, just less fuel in the engine, less urgency to defend the narrative. This matters because the version of them you're holding right now, the one that looks entirely guilty, entirely responsible, is partly a photograph locked in time. Your hurt is real. Your certainty is real. But your brain's quiet capacity to see their complexity, their own wounds, their flawed humanity will return if you don't interrupt it. The move is not to keep refreshing the anger before that natural decay happens. Don't reread old messages. Don't collect fresh evidence. Don't loop the story with friends who will pour fuel on it. Let the blame sit and lose its charge, the way all intense emotions eventually do. Accountability emerges in silence. You know that feeling when you stop texting someone and realize after 3 days that you haven't checked your phone in hours. That space where you used to reach for them is just empty air now. That's not relief. That's where accountability actually lives, in the small repeated choice to sit with what you did without explaining it away. For them, no contact becomes a mirror they can't avoid. Every time they think about calling you, they feel the weight of why you're not there. Every excuse they'd normally make to themselves gets thinner because you're not present to argue against it or soften it with your voice. The silence doesn't let them off easy. It doesn't hand them the dopamine hit of connection, the chance to prove they've changed, the reassurance that you still care enough to stay engaged. What accountability actually demands, and this is what most people miss, is that they face themselves without your presence to define them against. No villain role to play, no misunderstood hero narrative waiting to be rewritten. Just them, alone, with the gap they created. Some people get smaller in that space, others start to grow, but neither happens fast, and neither happens while they're still getting your energy, your reactions, your emotional labor feeding the old pattern. The silence forces them to stop borrowing identity from the dynamic and start finding one on their own, and that takes longer than they expect. Real change doesn't happen because you left. It happens because you stayed gone long enough for them to meet themselves in the dark and finally see what they've been without you. The maturation forced by absence. 3 months after you leave, they still reach for the phone in the car before remembering. That phantom reflex is not nostalgia, It is the nervous system losing its dependency script. What starts as withdrawal becomes something quieter and stranger. They are meeting parts of themselves they outsource to you. The person who always called first is learning what silence tastes like. The one who relied on your reassurance is now the only voice in the room when doubt arrives. This is not the same person sitting alone. Absence is a forcing function. Without you there to absorb their anxiety, manage their social calendar, or validate their choices before they act, they cannot hide from themselves anymore. They have to decide if they actually believe what they say, if they genuinely want what they claim to want, if they can exist without running commentary. It is brutal because growth often is. Some people break here and come back seeking the old arrangement. Others find something unexpected, a version of themselves that is less reactive, more certain, capable of sitting with their own confusion without needing someone else to make sense of it. The weird part is that this version of them, the one forced to grow, will never fully disappear, even if they return to someone else. They have touched a different way of being, a maturity that does not evaporate. It lives underneath, available now, a permanent shift in the architecture of who they are. That change is irreversible, and yes, they might resent you for forcing it. Or eventually, quietly, they might understand it was the most honest thing you ever gave them. Reflection without your interference. You leave, and the quiet starts to work on them whether you plan for it or not. Without you there to react to, defend against, or orbit around, they have to sit with whoever they actually are. No mirror, no audience, no one to trigger the best or worst version of themselves into existence. The thing is, reflection needs space to breathe, and you are taking up all of it just by existing in their life. Every interaction was a negotiation, a test, a wound being reopened, or a bandage being placed. Their energy went toward managing you, explaining themselves to you, or fighting with you, not toward looking inward. The silence after you leave doesn't instantly make them wise or honest with themselves, but it does something quieter. It removes the obstacle. They can't blame the relationship anymore. They can't say you made them act that way, that you didn't understand, that if you just listened differently, everything would have been better. Those narratives still exist, sure, but without you there to argue against them, they start to sound thinner. Reality has a way of showing up when the performance ends. Some people use that space to grow, to actually examine what they did, how they hurt you, what patterns they keep repeating. Others double down, rebuild the story, find new people to cast in your role. But either way, they're doing it alone now. The reflection that matters most is the one that happens without an audience, without someone there to soften it or argue against it. You can't make that happen. You can only step away and let the silence do what it does. The consequences they finally feel. You've been gone long enough now that the distraction phase is over. The urgent tasks, the rebounds, the desperate busyness, all of it has worn thin. And now, in the quiet mornings or late at night when the phone doesn't buzz with your name, they're starting to feel what you've known for weeks. Absence isn't theoretical anymore. It's a texture. It's the coffee they make for two. It's the story nobody laughs at. It's reaching for your number out of muscle memory and stopping halfway because the map in their head hasn't updated yet. Here's what they're colliding with that they weren't prepared for. Consequences aren't punishment someone else dishes out. They're the gap between what they did and what stopped happening as a result. They could have called, but didn't. They could have changed, but didn't. And now the world has reorganized itself around the fact that they made certain choices. You're not there. The door they left open is actually closed. The relationship they took for granted is now sealed away. gathering dust on a shelf they can still see but can't reach. Most people believe they can think their way out of this, that if they just understand what went wrong, the hollow feeling will resolve. It doesn't work that way. Understanding and feeling run on different rails entirely. They might intellectually grasp that losing you was their responsibility, but the body registers something simpler. I wanted something. I did nothing to keep it. Now it's gone. That small daily evidence that their inaction had weight is what finally makes them understand they weren't invincible. That's the moment something shifts, not because they figured it out, but because they felt it. Learned helplessness in reaching out. After you left, they probably tried texting you once, maybe twice, maybe more, but each message went unanswered. Each call went to voicemail. The silence stacked up like a wall, brick by brick. At some point, something shifts inside them. Not a resignation exactly, but something quieter and stranger. The belief that reaching out no longer works, that attempting it is pointless because the outcome is already decided. This is learned helplessness sneaking in through the back door, and it's why some people who miss you terribly will stop trying to contact you altogether. Learned helplessness is what happens when repeated failure teaches the brain to stop trying. A lab rat gets shocked every time it presses a lever, so eventually it stops pressing. A person sends 5 messages and gets nothing back, so the 6th message never gets typed. The brain isn't lazy, it's efficient in a devastating way. It says, you've done this before, it didn't work, so why spend the energy? What makes this cruel is that your silence doesn't just hurt them in the moment, it rewires their expectations about whether connection with you is even possible. They're not choosing to give up cleanly or rationally. They're being conditioned the way any animal learns that certain doors are locked. And here's what haunts the aftermath. Their silence back to you isn't peace or indifference. It's a learned response. So when you eventually reach out, they might not come back with hope or anger or even grief. They might come back with nothing at all because somewhere in the loop of unanswered attempts, they stopped believing that reaching toward you could ever end in anything but silence.